so recording from now. And I think I'm going to open it so I can see some other people are joining. So Zach is coming in and Henri has joined us. Welcome. So we will, hi, nice to see you. We will spotlight Bo so that Bo appears when he comes up. So I'm just going to go spotlight there. And then we'll remove the spotlight and we'll put the spotlight on Peter and Sarah once you're done with your introduction. Is that okay?
Yep.
Okay. Oh, it's 1:30. Is it okay with everybody if I click start?
Yeah.
Okay, good
Sure.
to go. Best of luck and enjoy, everybody. See you now. And Bo, you can start speaking after we remove the slide.
Hello and welcome to the Swedish Council of Finance ECGI Conference on Sustainable Finance and Corporate Governance. We are delighted for everyone who's here, and those who will join us through a recorded version of this a little bit later are also very welcome. This has been a pleasure to prepare this conference. There's so much interesting work in this area right now. I think working with ECGI has been a huge pleasure, and the organizing committee has found everything super convenient. And I'm sure many of you are here today through the excellent network that the ECGI provides for practitioners and academics with an interest in this area. This is lovely. Also, the support teams have been great, and I think everybody has figured out how to work Zoom. But should something go wrong, I apologize in advance. It could happen. I would also like to mention that we have some faraway participants for whom this is late at night or early in the morning, and I appreciate you accommodating our European afternoon schedule. We moved the conference so that it is Friday, Saturday, Sunday afternoon, Central European time, in order to make it more feasible for people to join from all around. But of course, it's not going to be perfect if you're in Hawaii. So we appreciate your participation especially. Okay, we have a great set of speakers today. Let me not go through all of them. I will mention them one at a time when we get there in the schedule. I will just start by mentioning that the day gets more academic as we progress. We're going to start by talking about life in the corporate governance jungle. What is it like out there? And my colleague, Sarah Jack, also a professor at the Stockholm School of Economics, will lead this conversation, and I hand over to you, Sarah.
I'm just going to try and share my screen. Hopefully it'll work. Okay. So thank you, Bo, for your kind invitation to join you today, and especially in today's activities. And thank you to everybody else who's also joined us today and taken the time to come and listen to us. So my name is Sarah Jack, and I'm the Jacob and Marcus Wallenberg Professor of Innovative and Sustainable Business Development at the House of Innovation, Stockholm School of Economics. And I'm delighted today to be joined by Peter Wallenberg Jr., the chair of the Nutt and Alice Wallenberg Foundation, the Marion and Marcus Wallenberg Foundation, and Wallenberg Foundations AB. And through his activities, Peter is also involved in the engineering industry, the private equity and the hotel business. He is also director on the boards of Atlas Copco, Scania, EQT, and is chairman of the Grand Group and the Royal Swedish Automobile Club. He holds a BSBA in Hotel Administration from the University of Denver and an International Baccalaureate from the American School Leysen, Switzerland. Now, the Wallenberg Foundations are the ultimate owners of the companies in which the Wallenberg family has an involvement. The Foundation's core holdings consist of the majority of owned and publicly listed Investor AB and wholly owned FAM AB. These companies include some of Scandinavia's largest and most important blue chip corporations. And the Foundations grant funding to excellent researchers and research projects beneficial to Sweden and have since 1917 granted over 35 billion Swedish kronor. And this equates to approximately 3.3 billion euros, which is a staggering amount of support. And grants are used to fund research in the fields of medicine, technology, natural sciences, social sciences, humanities, and archaeology. And given that the Wallenberg Foundations is the collective name for the 17 public and private foundations established by individual members of the Wallenberg family, I see this as a great opportunity for us to have Peter to join us on the stage, as it were, today. Now, the Wallenberg family business story started when Andrew Oscar Wallenberg helped a friend to find the financial resources to expand a sawmill in the region of Dalarna, north of Stockholm in Sweden. He subsequently moved to Sweden and pursued an entrepreneurial career, founding Stockholm in Skellada Bank SEB in 1856. And from the start, the Wallenberg family have worked hard to support enterprise and research in Sweden and internationally. And the Wallenberg family has always been concerned with supporting companies of Swedish origin that are looking to grow their operations in international markets. And in building and developing its interests, the Wallenberg family tradition has primarily been to focus on innovation and long-term sustainability through financial vigilance. And this focus has continued, and today the fifth generation of the family, led by Jacob, Marcus and Peter Jr. Wallenberg, continues to work to support enterprise and research through its historical roots, and embedding the traditions which have been used to generate much of its long-term success. The general model is that family representatives do not work actively in the companies or other organisations they control, but they exercise their involvement, direction and control through positions in the boards of directors. And against that background, what we thought we would do through our session today is to engage in a conversation about the long-term governance of family business. And long-lasting family businesses do not only look at the financial result of the next quarter. Owners of enduring family businesses value their history and their future. And such family businesses often make decisions with a much longer horizon in mind. And this horizon is often with the next generation in mind as well. So a guiding principle for the Wallenberg's family's work in terms of how it organises its influences in the foundations and the business holdings is the betterment of the country of Sweden. So with these aspects in mind, we will begin today by exploring the subject of governance with Peter. And welcome, Peter Wallenberg. Thank you. I'm going to stop sharing my screen. We'll see what happens now. Whoops.
Hi, Sarah.
Hi. So are you happy if we just get started?
Sure.
Thank you. It's a bit strange. It's, So Peter, to begin, can you tell us about what the main principles are when it comes to organising interests in the companies and foundations with which you work?
I mean, we talk about what we call our ecosystem, which means, you know, how is all of this put together? As you said, we are today 16 family foundations, and we take care of 17 foundations under the name Wallenberg Foundations, just to make it easy. And these foundations own stock in companies like Investor and our wholly owned FAM. Investor owns companies like Atlas Copco. You know that it's part of the Stockholm Stock Exchange in that sense. FAM is more of a privately run investment company, wholly owned by the foundations. And all the dividends that we do get from these investments goes back into the foundation's design. And 80% of that we give out every year to Swedish research and education. 20% we're allowed to reinvest, which means that we are still here after 117 years, to be honest with you. So in that sense, it's not a traditional family business because we as individuals don't own anything of it, but we are as a family the ones who are supposed to develop and continue to develop both the foundations as such, but especially the companies that the foundations have put their money into and invested in. And as you said, I mean, from our perspective, what we look at is long-term ownership, long-term responsibility. And we do that with the goal of seeing to it that we in the long term can also support the development of Sweden. So we're a strange family business in that sense, but it is forever as it looks right now.
And, you know, to me as well, when you talk about the ecosystem and the putting together for the betterment of Sweden, I think that's an incredible kind of thing that the whole kind of organisation or the ecosystem actually offers as well. So what kind of led things to being organised in that way?
Again?
What led to things being organised in this way?
Being part of the fifth generation, a proud member of the fifth generation, it all started really in 1917 or 1916-17, when Knut and Alice, who didn't have any children, and during their own lifetime, spent a lot of their own fortune on trying to help the development of Sweden around themselves. And at that time, there was a lot of social questions, but they also helped to build a Stockholm library and started to help to finance new buildings at Swedish universities and things like that. So, and when they became a little bit older, realizing with no kids and didn't want the family to fight over their fortune, they started the Knut and Alice Wallenberg Foundation. And today that is Sweden's largest contributor to research and education. So that's really how it started. From then on, another 15 have done the same thing. Some have started while they're still alive and worked with it while they were still alive. I usually bring up, when I get this question, I usually bring up Berit Wallenberg, who was a lady that when I was a kid, I was pretty scared of, because she was a photographer and an archaeologist. But she was very short, she had big feet, she was always wearing really dark brown dresses and looked pretty scary. So every time we went to a family dinner, everybody of the kids ran into another room. But when I started to work with the foundations, I realized that she started her foundation in midlife. And her foundation is today, it's not a big foundation, but it's the most important foundation and contributed to research within archaeology and cultural history in Sweden. And I have to say that her way of thinking symbolizes the way that the family is trying to think, and that is, you know, we are fortunate to have jobs and things to do, and what can we do to see to it that we can use that in a longer term and see to it that we help others and the development of Sweden. So Berit, even though she's a small foundation, is one of my favorites.
That's really interesting as well. And it shows how the family influence through all kind of stages has made the future as well and taken things forward. But was it difficult to set things up in this way, do you think?
It's probably controversial in 1917 that the rest of the family wasn't able to get a hold of the fortune of Knut and Alice. So that was probably like in any other family. But I think that after that was done, that has been the way that the family has been working. I have to admit that when I was younger, 70s, 60s, 70s, 80s, the foundations were not really the thing that we talked about. It was the businesses we talked about and everything that the foundations really owned. But the foundations were not the main topic. So when I started to know about the foundations was when I was brought in as a member of a board of a smaller foundation, just to learn what board work was all about. And then realizing that the family had been working by or through the foundations since 1917, and that the foundations was really the main platform of the family. And as you know, from the past 20 years, we worked very hard on seeing to it and form the ecosystem to see to it that people around us also understand that it is not the individual family members, it is the foundations that are. So I have to say, to answer your question shortly, it has worked out pretty well to work in a setting like this.
And how important is it for you to kind of unite around a set of values, of principles, and kind of build a vision for the future?
I think that's extremely important. And when we were younger, the generations before us, the way that they took this forward was to point with their whole hand, because that was the way it was at the time. What we are trying to do is to see to it that we work together with the next generation. So we have actually seen to it that we have a family constitution today, where the different generations have been talking about what are the values of the family, what is important for us, what does that mean for the foundation, what does it mean for the family as a whole. So today we watch much more, how should you say, on the same page within the family. We have something that we can lean back on and say that this is something that we all agree on. It's not that all and everyone will work within it, but this is the way that the foundations and the families work with the foundations will continue in the future.
And is there anything maybe specific or anything that kind of comes to your mind about what's really important in making this work? Because it's an incredible story.
Yeah, I think the main thing was to see to it that, I mean, we've been lucky to be three, me, my brother, and my cousin who's been working with this. My father was pretty much alone, and before that, usually it was two family members working with the family business, if one can use that term. And we now have a next generation with 32 people. Yeah, and you know, how do you see to it that they understand what we're doing, what the family is all about, and also see to it that they get an interest in what we're doing, because to work in a family setting like ours, if you're only out to make a huge amount of money, you're not supposed to work for us, to be honest with you, because it is all in the foundations. So it has to be a lot of heart. It has to be a lot of commitment from you as an individual. So it was important for us to see to it that we had somewhere to start in all of this, to get the next generation to be interested. And then we continued from that. I mean, we do have a general assembly every year where all family members can come in and ask questions. And we have a family working group where 3 people from the 5th generation, me, my brother, and my cousin, and 3 from the 6th generation, and the 3 from the 6th generation we changed every year, and they choose themselves who should represent them in the family working group. So we're trying to find ways to see to it that we can help in a process that's going to be long.
And it's really fascinating, I think, that kind of that sharing that goes on within that process as well, and the fact that it is about building the future. It is.
It's all about that. But I mean, we're in the middle of it. It's easy for us to talk about it. But if you have 32 young people in the middle of their own career, and try to see to it that they understand what all this is about. I mean, you know, you met Jacob and Husky. I mean, they travel a lot. They're never at home. Is that really what the next generation are looking for? Or does that make them scared, or they don't understand why? So we're trying to build something above that to see to it that they realize that it's all about our own commitment as individuals. I use myself as an example. I mean, I took a completely different route compared to my brother and cousin. I went into the service industry already when I was 15. I started to work after school and continue to do that and run hotels for 30 years. And none in the family had done that before. So of course, there's a lot from the next generation that says, if you don't go the business way, meaning the bank or investor or something, does that mean that you cannot go into the family business? And I'm trying to use myself as an example that, no, you can actually grow into that too. So it's all up to you. It's your own, your own thoughts, ideas, and commitment that is the thing that counts.
And what do you think kind of makes, the next generation and your generation buy into that kind of understanding, I suppose?
Well, I hope they will. We're still working hard. We've been doing this for the past 6-7 years. We got our family constitution in place, 3 years ago, 4 years ago. So it's still something that, we're working very actively on. But we are trying to bring them with us in different things that we do. I bring them to the universities when I work, when I represent the foundations. I bring them with me. My brother and cousin brings them with them when they do other things, just to give them an idea. Not all of these 30 people are going to work for the foundations going forward, but I hope and I think actually that everything that we do now makes them a little bit curious and probably and hopefully as proud as we are in what our ancestors has done, and actually want to be part of seeing to it that this can continue to develop. So if we get some of them to take over where we are, we'll be very, very happy.
And it sounds to me sort of very inclusive as well, which reflects Sweden and its society.
Oh, thank you. I didn't know that. No, I'm just kidding. No, but yes, it has to be. I mean, everybody who has any idea of anything should be able to be part of this. Doesn't matter what you want to do. I mean, if there's someone who just want to work with Berit's foundation, we should give them the opportunity to do that. If somebody wants to work with the foundation on the business side, we should try to help them to find that route.
And you mentioned your broad experience, or your broader experience, and the kind of international career that you had before getting more involved with the foundations. And what do you think that kind of brought to the foundations for you? What was the kind of key things that maybe came through from that?
I think if you look at the way that me, my brother, and my cousin work with each other today, we found for us a very natural way of dividing the different tasks. And I mean, they are business people more than I am. I love to run businesses and I love to work with people. So I think what I brought into it is that. I mean, I have in that sense, Jacob and Marcus are extremely good at what they're doing. And I try to put my experience from a completely different business into everything that we do. So I shouldn't say that I know what I brought into it, but I think that I can be a little bit wider in that kind of questions than they are as business people or financially focused.
Which again helps to kind of move things forward as well at the same time, doesn't it? Particularly when you think what you're trying to do there.
Yeah, I think we complement each other very well because of that.
So, in your view, are there differences between how this generation and the next generation will lead the group and its interests, do you think?
I think the first thing is that since it is foundations and the statues of the foundations are 100 years old, that will not change. So I think the main goal will be the same. But I think the way that we run everything and look at what we do is different from the previous generation. And I think it's going to be the same for the next generation. We know in our discussions and meetings that we have with them that, questions that they bring up, it's of course sustainability and other questions that have always been on our agenda, but has been one of many. So I think it's just that there will be a focus on other questions, but I don't think there will be huge changes in, or it can't be due to the statutes of the foundation. be huge differences in what the foundations do or how we invest and things like that.
It's quite interesting there because you touched on the kind of roots and traditions. I would imagine that within the foundations and the businesses, that these kind of roots and traditions are very important. And I think for family businesses, especially, that tends to be something that they do refer back to. Yeah,
of course it is. I mean, as I said, I'm a proud member of the 5th generation, and I look back on what each generation has done throughout the years. One has to be proud. I mean, it's been different times, but there has been the same goal all the time, and that is for the betterment of Sweden. So even if it's done in different ways, it's still the same focus, and it is still the same goal. And I think that's probably the main and most important thing.
Now, you touched on sustainability briefly there, and I'm going to maybe, if we've got time, move to explore that more later in the conversation. But what are particularly pressing issues, do you think, for the next generation?
I mean, the world around us is moving much faster. So I think that we are in the middle of something. We are 3, and we know that we have a tough time to keep up. And so, of course, that will be a huge challenge for the next generation to be able to use all the changes that will happen for the benefit of everything that they're doing. But that's also one of the reasons that I hope that it's going to be more, at least more than 1, but maybe not 10, but there will be more of the next generation who would like in different ways to work with the foundations and the businesses within the foundation.
So kind of taking that forward, if you were to look into the future, how do you think the Wallenberg Group might be organized in 10 years from now?
10 years? Mm. I'll be still around. No, I'm just kidding. My brother and cousin are much older than me, so no. I think in that sense, it will not be any huge differences. I think you will see that companies in our portfolios are different in some ways. But I think that what we are doing and how we are built as a structure will be the same in 10 years. Even though everything is moving extremely rapidly, we've been around doing about the same thing in different ways for over 100 years. So I don't think that will change a lot.
And what about 20 years from now?
Then I probably are not working any longer. It's 20 years is an extremely long period of time in today's times. As I said, with everything changing so rapidly, I wouldn't dare to have any guess in that sense. But the only thing I can really underline, and once again, I mean, our ancestors were pretty smart that they wrote the rules and regulations for the foundations in the way that they did, which means that huge differences will not be there. And as long as we find the people who have the heart in this, even the companies within the portfolios will continue to grow long term and will be even stronger in 20 years. And the foundations will be able to give even more money to Swedish research and education.
But the foresight of those founders is absolutely incredible, isn't it, really, when you think, you know, how it's...
Yeah, I mean, if you start to... oops. Can you see me? Yeah, there we go. Yeah, if you start to read through the history books and read some of the documents from their time, yeah, I have to say that they were looking many years ahead of their own time in that sense.
And it's incredible to be part of that story.
Yeah, I'm extremely proud, to be honest with you. So I don't know, everybody's trying to get a hold of me someday. Yeah.
So what do you believe are the main strengths of family ownership in the business environment we have today?
I think if with the experience we have from family businesses in Sweden, I think it is the commitment. In that sense, I think that the development always being trying to be in the forefront because it is yours and your families. I think those are probably the most important parts. From our perspective, as I said, we're not a traditional family run business. So for us, it's more about being good at what do you say in English? Continue to develop something that somebody has started. You can help in seeing to it that it keeps on developing in your own time. But you don't really get you don't get the financial benefit or anything like that from it. But I think in a traditional family business, that is always going to be a part of it. But that also means that in many cases, family businesses only last 3 generations. And we're now trying to get in the 6 generations into ours. So I think family businesses are extremely important as call it a system, call it what you want. But it's also a complicated one because it is difficult to make that long term if it's only the family being the owners. And once again, I mean, the way that we are able to run this is a fantastic way of seeing to it that it can continue.
And it's a fascinating view as well on family business, I think. Because it is.
It is.
Yeah.
But I mean, we live in Sweden, so I mean, not everyone thinks that foundations is a good way. When I know that when my grandfather, when he lived, there was a lot of people who said that, oh, but foundations just only try to get away from taxes. But we don't earn anything from this. Everything goes back to society. So, but that is, that's something that we have to work with, and that I work very hard with, and that is to make people understand how the ecosystem works, and that it is not us as individuals that make any profit from this. It is society that makes all the profits, which means it's actually tax money getting back into the system without going through bureaucracy.
And society benefits in so many different ways. It's not just
exactly
money going into the system, it's what it actually produces as well.
Yeah.
Which is incredible. And what do you think are the main weaknesses, perhaps, then, of, sort of the way it's organized?
I don't think we have any. No. I think it's always a weakness in the change of a generation, because once again, it's all about the individual wanting or not wanting to be part of it. And if there is none in the 6th generation who would like to continue with this, what does that mean? Who will then be taking the decisions for the foundations that are, and at the end of the day, have our family name on them, which means that whatever they do, it's going to fall back on the family. So I think that, but I don't call it a weakness in that sense. It's a difficult step. So I don't really see any weaknesses in at least in what we have. There are no weaknesses because we can be really bad at what we're doing, to be honest. But the foundations will continue to be part of Swedish society.
And do you have any other sort of advice for how this might be dealt with in the future? Or how other families might kind of pick up on things?
No, I wish I could. I mean, it is extremely difficult. It's also very different from country to country. As we know, I mean, our system works very well here in Sweden because we have a foundation system, which means that we are not getting taxed on the dividends that we get because we give them away. But we don't have to take from our cash in the foundations. But in the United States, you have to take from the capital in foundations. So they will not be able to last as long as we are. So it depends a lot of where you are and how you can use the different systems. And when I use the word use, I don't mean in a negative way or trying to get away from something else. What I'm saying is that depending on in which country you are, there are different ways of finding ways where it would be easier for families to be able to continue through generations with their businesses, and trying to find ways to see to it that it's not only 3 generations.
And as you
but it's difficult.
Yeah. But as you kind of reflect on things as well, and you talked about research. So what do researchers offer the foundation?
What kind of research we do, or?
Well, what do they offer you? You know, why do you do it? What's the kind of core thing about it for you?
Could there be anything else? I mean, come on, it's the future. No, but for us, it's also about from the foundation's point of view. We're also working a lot with trying to see to it that the next generation of researchers gets a platform. So 10 years ago, we started to see to it that Swedish universities could attract young researchers, both Swedish researchers that were at foreign universities and bring them back to Sweden, and foreign young researchers that we needed in Sweden to see to it that we got the right type of research being done in Sweden. Today we have 400 of these young researchers at different universities in Sweden. So that's an important thing in what we're doing. But
and I think those kind of numbers are very important.
It is, and to be honest, I'm pretty proud that it's 50-50 male female also, which is good, which is something that we work very hard on from the foundation's point of view to see to it that the university. I mean, I travel around to all the universities in Sweden. I meet the researchers, and I realize that we don't get the applications for projects from the female researchers from the university. So I mean, it's something that we've been pushing for many years to the universities, and we know they're there. How come you don't send their applications? This year, now, we actually have 60% of the project financing this year is for female researchers. So I mean, it takes time, but it's worth it because we know it's there. It's just that, you know, sometimes you need to poke and say, we know, you don't. So please listen and learn. But then, I mean, we're also in the situation, being a foundation, that we can be less bureaucratic. So which means that we can start projects much more rapidly than the politicians can do. So if you take our WASP project, which is within AI, autonomous systems, etc. I mean, we started a research school. We today have 22 companies being part of the research. And we go from, in Sweden, of having nothing within this research to being one of the leaders in Europe. And we've done that within 4 years. And we've been able to get international researchers to apply to Swedish universities to be part of WASP. So, I mean, we can help to see to it that, you know, what's good here can be used in a better way than we are doing, and we can take rapid decisions. So that's something that's, you know, we're proud of, and in most cases it works. But it's also, you know, we started something called Wood Science Center at KTH and Chalmers. And that was to see to it, and it was all financed by us, because we realized, in both being owners within the forest industry and being part of the research community, that there was nothing really being done when it came to the usage of the Swedish forestry. You know, you can't make paper out of everything, and you can't just burn it. So what can we do with it? And today, I mean, those researchers are the one that you read about that put out solar cells in see-through windows, all made out of wood, or PET bottles made out of fibers instead of plastics, etc., etc. And when you realize that you've been part of starting things like this, and you see the effect of this, and these researchers, then you're really proud, and you understand how important foundations like ours can be. But we also realize that Sweden, being a very, very small country, we need to see to it that everybody realizes that we need to put both academia, business, private institutions like ours, and politics into this, and so that everybody realized they have to be part of and putting money into this, or Sweden will lag behind. And we can be a part of having that dialogue also, and spread the word in that sense, and try to find solutions to these kinds of problems. We tried it with COVID now too. I mean, we don't have any bureaucracy, so I mean, we put 100 million into the research around COVID rapidly, but we also saw to it that Sweden got their largest test center in place within 3 weeks, because we didn't have any capacity in Sweden, and that we can do because we are small, and we have the funds to help.
And again, when I saw how quickly you kind of moved there, I thought that was very impressive, considering what's happening elsewhere. But
yeah.
So, Peter, can we kind of move now to consider sustainability and its importance as a long-term focus, which also impacts on governance? And I want to do this because I know how important sustainability is for you, but also how it's always sat at the very heart of what the Wallenberg Foundations and family do.
Yeah.
So what is your point of departure when it comes to sustainability?
I think that talking about sustainability is sometimes extremely difficult, but because most people, when they talk about sustainability, they talk about the environment. Mm-hmm. And we're trying to widen it much wider than that, because sustainability is, of course, about the environment and the climate, but it's also about people in the community. It's innovation, it's research, it's business ethics and governance. So from our perspective, and I know you read the investors' book on how we work with this, and that's just one example. But those are the things that we bring forward in all the companies that we work with. We feel it's actually a sustainable question to see to it that in the rapidly changing environment when it comes to technology, companies should also put in reskilling and upskilling as part of the sustainable future, meaning that your biggest and most valuable resource is your staff, and you need to see to it that you use them going forward too. It's not that you just change them because things are changing around you. You have to take it and look at it as out of a complete perspective. So yes, all of these things are extremely important for us. We feel that is being responsible long-term owners. This is the main point. I mean, this is that we try to, in the boardrooms where we can be representatives of the foundation, we can bring these questions up and see, where are you? What are you doing? But once again, everything is moving extremely quick and very rapid. And I think one of the main problems is that you can find management in companies who believe they're doing a lot. But if you go 1 or 2 steps down in the organization, you're not doing very much. And how do you see to it as owners that this is something that is part of the DNA of the companies that you're running also? And I think that's the largest challenge. To talk about it, we're good at that. But we also need to see to it that we're good at getting it into the structure and being part of the company's DNA.
And what does sustainability, do you think, kind of mean to you as a business family? And I mean that, throughout the generations as well. No,
but it is our future. I mean, it's the company's future. If they don't take these questions seriously and work with it, who want to work with them? What kind of company will you be? What kind of products will you produce? So I think that it is one of the most important questions that any company have today, to see to it that you find your way of working in these and around these questions.
And how was sustainability introduced to you?
As I said, I was in the service industry, and I was running hotels. So one can say from that perspective, it was something that became pretty natural to me, because you get pretty pissed off, sorry about the language, when you realize that you throw away 40% of all the food that you have produced in a hotel or in a restaurant. And you realize that there is no way that you can use that in any other way. I mean, I can give you an example that running the Grand Hotel in Stockholm, we realized how much food we wasted every day. Of course, we tried to make things to do less, but it was still huge amount. So we tried to find farmers who, you know, pig farms and others who could then take the food. But Swedish laws of clean food is tougher for pigs than for people, so they were not allowed to eat our food, which makes it difficult. But it also meant that you started to look yourself in, okay, so what's another solution? What other questions is it that, you know, you can work with? Today, Grand Hotel is actually part of a completely closed system, made out of vacuum. So you have 3 tunnels going into the walls at the bottom of the hotel where you can throw different kinds of waste that is then being taken care of in underground valves in Stockholm, used for heat and for other things. So I was introduced to it pretty early in that sense. But when it comes to, you know, business ethics and those kinds of questions, it is when you start to get into and being able to be a part of a board or something that you realize the complexity of companies going abroad, trying to do business abroad, and the follow-up questions that you get from that. Then you realize that, you know, these are new challenges. You know, how do you solve these? How do you work in these questions? So I would say that pretty early, I was introduced in many different ways. You know, depending on the question, it's more or less difficult to find solutions for it.
And what does sustainability mean, do you think, for the portfolio companies and their activities?
Everything. Once again, I think it is their future. And that's the reason I'm saying that it is important for us to point this out to them and make them understand that we as owners are on top of the question, meaning we bring it up, we want answers. But most of our companies are doing very well and work with it. But you have to learn that it's not only what happens within your own walls. It's, you know, who's delivering what from where and how. You know, you have a supplier in another country. How do they do their products? It's much more difficult and much wider to some of these companies. But one should give them credit that they're doing, you know, a heck of a job. But once again, everything is moving so fast that you really need to be on the top of your toes all the time in these questions, because it changes so fast.
And in terms of the kind of the boards of the firms that you work with, how do you kind of work with sustainability there? How do you kind of, you know, ensure that it is included in their thinking, their design, their way of delivering?
It is something that we see to it that it is on the agenda of board meetings, so that we get a report. But I think that we need to take it, you know, one more step and see to it that it goes further down. A board meeting is a board meeting, but is that reality in all senses, or is that a presentation for the members of the board? So I think we need to find ways of getting a deeper understanding of how it works further down in the structure of companies. It's going to be difficult, but I mean, we have to find ways.
And would you say that the role of sustainability then has been changing? And you mentioned a couple of examples when we were talking about governance as well. But do you think that the role of sustainability has really been changing? Yeah,
absolutely. I think so. And as I say, I mean, working with the sixth generation, I know it's something that they're poking at us and say, you know, what are you doing? What is the foundations doing? So I made a very short study. I asked the office to go through all the applications for different projects at the foundation to see how many were around sustainability. And we realized that in the application, it was not a lot. But you realize that in close to 90%, the effect of the project had to do with sustainability. So, and that's also important to realize that it's not always that you get an application that says, I want to change this or do this better. But during the time of the research, they will realize that there are things that will change, and use it. See to it that it's actually being brought out to be used by others. So I think that's good. I mean, I'm not going to push researchers in that way, because I know they will get there. It doesn't matter what they do research about. This will be part of what comes out of it.
Yeah. And I mean, I see you as leaders in sustainability issues, but I just wondered if you consider yourselves as leaders in sustainability issues within your industries. And I like the way that the perspective that you take on the whole kind of sustainability issue.
I can say this. You can never say that you're good at something like this, because that would mean that you would relax. And I think what's important here is to see to it that you follow up and change with time and the questions that will come up, instead of getting stuck in something that you felt you were doing good.
Thank you. Is there anything more that you would like to add at this stage?
No. No, it was a pleasure to be here. It's always difficult. It's a new way of life right now, doing things like this over Zoom or Teams or something else. Life will probably not be the same after all of this. I think we learned a lot of positive things. We learned a lot of negative things, but I think that we will be more efficient after this.
I hope so. Yeah.
I know. Let's say we will.
We will. That's it.
Yeah. Good. Good.
So, thank you for that. And I'd really like to end this session. I'm conscious of time, and I'm also conscious that you're a very busy person as well. And thank everybody for listening. But I'd also like to say a very big thank you to you, Peter, for taking the time to speak with us today and for sharing your thoughts and experiences. And we're extremely grateful, thank you. And I know that I've learned a lot from listening from you today, but I always do. I always find it very fascinating. And I'd also like to thank Professor Matthias Nordqvist, who kind of helped us form the questions as well and develop the questions for today. So thank you as that. We have some time left, I think, Bo, do we? About 5 minutes left, if there's anybody who would like to ask a question.
We do.
Bo, was there anything, I noticed you're kind of bit in the chat and I picked up on that, but I don't know if there's anything else that you want to add to that.
I have been monitoring the chat and I got a couple of messages. Maybe I can convey some of those questions. So maybe not all of the listeners, everybody who's online can understood the relationship between all these companies, the crown jewels of Swedish industrialism, and many new companies that you own or own part of. Mm-hmm. There's some statements here with the foundations and investor. Could you talk for a couple of minutes about just how that structure looks?
Absolutely. The Foundations is the largest shareholder of the public investment company Investor. Investor own companies like ABB, Atlas Copco, Electrolux, Ericsson, Wärtsilä, Finland, etc. But they're all public companies. On the other side, we have a privately owned investment company called FAM, Foundation Asset Management, where we own companies like, or have stock in companies like Stora Enso, Saab, smaller companies like Höganäs, Nefab, and others. And then one should add that Investor has a sister company called Patricia Investments or Patricia Industries. And in Patricia Industries, you have companies like Mölnlycke within healthcare. They actually own the Grand Hotel and other smaller companies that they own 100% or are the majority shareholder of. Did that explain enough? I can go even further, but
no, that's great. But you talked extensively about the role of the family here, and what is the you want to engage the next generation and so on. What's the extent of the family? How far into this vast?
These businesses are we?
Yeah.
One can say that me, my brother, and my cousin, we represent the foundations on board levels. My brother is the chairman of Investor. My cousin Marcus is the chairman of the SEB Bank. I'm the chairman of the Wallenberg Foundations company. And then we work a lot with seeing to it that the boards of these companies have the competence that is needed to see to it that they will continue to develop. And if we look at how do we work with the next generation in these questions, we put the next generation first in the boards of the different foundations. So they start to learn the work or learn board work by being members of the foundations board, realizing, you know, what it means and what you have to do as a board member. It's not just to sit and listen. You have to be an active board member, being part of helping to develop whatever board you're working on and the company it represents. And hopefully this will lead to that they get good enough and interested enough to want to go further and go into company boards. And in that sense, we will see to it that their names come up, but it's not we as family who take the decision of the board members of the different companies. We have a, what do you call it in English? Valberedning.
Nomination committee.
Thank you, nomination committee, which is not run by us. So it you know, we're being very in that sense open-minded and as we say, I mean, we're not a job office for the next generation. They need to see to it that they are the ones with the drive and the interest of continue to develop.
Thank you. That's great. Those were my questions, Sarah.
Thank you. I think that's us then. I'm conscious that it's, yeah, we're almost there. Gosh, wow.
You were a little bit scared, weren't you, Sarah?
Perfect. Thank you both very much. We start again at 2:40 local time. That is in 14 minutes. Thank you both very much.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, everybody. Bye. Thanks, Peter.
Have a good conference.
Thanks.
Bye.
Hello, do you hear me?
I can hear you. Can you hear me?
I hear you.
I've got a feeling that everyone can hear us. I'm not sure.
Hi, yes, that's correct. We're on a break at the moment, but I think, is that Lucian who's just joined us?
Yes, I'm here.
Great.
Sounds like you
Colin,
hear
you're,
me okay.
no, so Colin, your audio and video is perfect, but I can't hear Lucian properly. Is there a way to improve your audio?
Yeah, you don't hear me loud enough, or?
Hold on now. No, it sounds like you're very far away. Hold on.
Let me maybe increase the volume. Just a second.
I also can't see you, but that might, hold on, I'll
You
try.
cannot see me?
Hold on now. I can see you, yes, I can see you perfectly, yes.
How is the volume now?
Much better, I can hear you.
Much better. You want me a bit louder?
Say, try again.
Is this the way you want to hear me, or a bit louder?
It depends if you want to shout through your presentation or not. So maybe a little louder.
A little louder, so let's just see. A little louder. How about now?
That's okay for me. It might be slightly too loud. Colin, is that okay?
Sounds a bit loud, actually.
A bit loud.
Loud. Let me just a bit louder, so less loud.
Oh, yeah.
Now?
Yeah, I think that should be okay.
Let me do that in screen. No, I think we could do the same. Elaine, can you maybe let me try to share my slide just to see whether it works?
You can, yeah, I can stop sharing now. Everybody else can see it too. You're live. So stop sharing. There we go. We'll start again in 5 minutes.
Oh, it says your screen sharing is paused.
Yeah, I can't see your slides. Do you want to try that again?
Let me try it again.
Sure. No, that didn't work. So you have somebody there helping. That's good. I can see them.
Sorry that I have all those difficulties.
No, not at all. This is the fun of Zoom.
The excitement.
Yes.
So now you see my slides?
I can see your slides. You might want to use full screen, but I can see them as they are.
That's full screen, let me see.
Okay.
Control L.
There you go.
Now it's okay?
I think you may have to use, yeah, no, perfect.
Yep, perfect.
Okay.
And you want to click through to make sure?
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, when are we supposed to start?
2 minutes. You have.
Oh, 2 minutes.
2 minutes.
That's what I like to see. Dying to get started.
All right, welcome back everybody, and those who just joined, welcome to the ECGI Swedish Council of Finance Stockholm School of Economics Conference on Sustainability and Corporate Governance. We will now do one session at a time with a short break in between. The format is that there's an author of a piece of research who will present it, and then there is a discussant who will discuss it, and then there's a little bit of time at the end potentially for the presenter to maybe comment. Also, if you have questions from the audience, all the participants are welcome to enter it through the Q&A function of Zoom. And then if there's time at the end, I will be happy to read out a few of those questions. And so I can moderate that at the end if we have time. So please feel free to enter questions there. Okay, without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Lucian Pepchuk, who is presenting joint work with Roberto Talarita on the illusory promise of stakeholder governance. And Lucian, I will intervene verbally when you have 5 minutes or so left, just to remind you. Otherwise, the floor is yours.
Thanks a lot, Bo. Delighted to be here. The motivation for this work doesn't require too much discussion. As all of you know, there is growing support for what we call quote-unquote stakeholderism, the view that corporate leaders should give weight to the well-being not just of stakeholders, but of shareholders. Sorry, not just of shareholders, but also of stakeholders at large, and should give weight to them when they make business decisions. Examples of this growing support, many of you know, is the Business Roundtable statement from a year ago and the Davos World Economic Forum Manifesto on stakeholder capitalism, and there are many other examples. We make two main points. First, we claim that stakeholderism benefits are illusory. Stakeholderism should not be expected to produce material benefits for stakeholders. Second, not only we're not going to get benefits for stakeholders, but stakeholderism is going to impose substantial costs, and embracing it would be harmful to many groups, including stakeholders themselves, and therefore our conclusion is that stakeholderism should be rejected, including by those who take shareholder interests seriously. And I want to say a word about us being among those who give a lot of weight to stakeholder interests. There are some opponents of stakeholderism who oppose it because they believe that market forces or contracts are sufficiently protective of stakeholder interests. However, we, like many supporters of stakeholder capitalism, we believe and we assume for the purpose of our analysis that the externalities that corporations impose on stakeholders raise substantial concerns. But the reason why we come out against stakeholder capitalism is that we conclude that it would not provide a good way for addressing those concerns. Indeed, it would be counterproductive. And what we need are external laws, regulations, and policies, things like carbon tax or labor protective measures. Those things, rather than counting on the discretion of corporate leaders, should be the focus of those who care about stakeholders like our discussant, Colin, and ourselves. We should at the outset distinguish between two versions of stakeholderism. What is often referred to as enlightened shareholder value. Under this view, corporate leaders should simply recognize that treating stakeholders is useful and often facilitates long-term value maximization. Under this version of stakeholderism, consideration of stakeholder interest is simply a means. That's why we call it instrumental stakeholderism. It's just a means to shareholder value maximization. And therefore, this version is not conceptually or operationally different from shareholder value maximization. The version that is conceptually different, and the one that calls for most attention, is what we call pluralistic stakeholderism, which treats stakeholder welfare not just as an instrument, but rather as an end in itself, and believes that corporate leaders should have a plurality of independent ends and must balance those interests of the various constituencies. Let me start by saying a few words about the Business Roundtable statement. Because when it was issued about a year ago, it was widely described as a major milestone, was portrayed in the media as a major philosophical shift that breaks with decades of long-held corporate orthodoxy. But in our paper, we provide various pieces of evidence that suggest that the statement was mostly for show, rather than a signal of changing attitudes or of coming shifts in the treatment of stakeholders. Just to illustrate, here are two pieces of evidence. One is we conducted a survey. We contacted the public relations officers of all the companies whose CEOs signed the Business Roundtable statement to inquire whether the joining of the statement was approved or ratified by the board, because things that are significant generally are brought to the board for approval or ratification. And we found out that all but one company did not have the endorsement of the Business Roundtable either approved or ratified by the board, which to us is consistent with the internal perception that the statement didn't really require any meaningful changes in how stakeholders are going to be treated. Another piece of evidence is we reviewed more than 150 corporate governance guidelines that are approved by the board and that every public company has. And the review indicated that still at this point in time, even though a very large number of companies updated their corporate governance guidelines since the statement was issued, the language of those guidelines is still very much reflecting a commitment to shareholder primacy. And anyone who's interested in this, there are several additional pieces of evidence in the paper that support the view that the Business Roundtable statement was mostly for show. But I don't want to dwell on this because putting aside the Business Roundtable statement, for us as academics, the more important question is, broadly speaking, should we expect stakeholderism to protect stakeholders beyond what would serve our shareholders? And because stakeholderism relies so critically on the discretion of corporate leaders, to answer this question, we need to resolve whether corporate leaders have incentives to benefit stakeholders beyond what would be good for shareholders. So in the paper, we conduct an analysis looking both at the theory and the evidence, including some evidence that we put forward. We look at the various elements like compensation, the labor market, the market for corporate control, and we conclude that there is a robust link between the interest of corporate leaders and shareholders, maybe not as close an alignment as scholars of corporate governance would like to see, but there is a robust link. And by contrast, the interests of CEOs and directors are not robustly linked with the interests of stakeholders. And therefore, an incentive analysis suggests that corporate leaders not only they don't have incentives, they have incentives not to protect stakeholders beyond the point that doing so would serve shareholder value maximization. We next go to examine empirically whether the past behavior of corporate leaders was consistent with this incentives conclusion. And we argue that a good setting for doing those tests is to look at the acquisition of companies in the large number of states in the US, where acquisitions are governed by constituency statutes, which do exactly what stakeholders would like to have, is they authorize corporate leaders to take into account the interest of stakeholders and not only shareholders when they are considering a sale. And we look at all the sales to private equity in the last 2 decades that were governed by such statutes. The paper presents evidence for the largest deals, and we have a companion paper for whom corporate leaders bargain that analyzes in detail each and every transaction in this large set. What do we find? We find that corporate leaders bargained substantially and with good results for shareholders, obtaining large premiums for them, and for corporate leaders themselves, obtaining both monetary payoffs and continued employment for themselves. But for whom corporate leaders did not bargain, even though the statutes expected and authorized them to do so, they did not negotiate at all for any constraints on the post-deal freedom of the buyer to fire employees, even though protection of labor was often cited as a major reason for the adoption of constituency statutes. And even though there is evidence that in fact there is significant reduction of employment after such sales, they did not negotiate for any protection of suppliers, customers, and creditors, other stakeholder groups that are often mentioned, or for the environment. And other than very few cases where there were cosmetic and legally unenforceable pledges, there were no protection for headquarter communities and against removal of headquarters. What lessons should we draw from this evidence? We argued that stakeholders must wrestle with the failure of constituency statutes, try to identify the reasons why those statutes did not deliver, and examine whether the same reasons would also not undermine stakeholderism, because, as many of us know, George Santayana warned us a century ago that those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it, and stakeholderism should avoid such pitfall. In our companion paper, we analyze in detail potential explanations for the failure of constituency statutes. We conclude that the most plausible explanation was rooted in the incentives of corporate leaders, and that stakeholderism should also be expected to fail to deliver because of the very same incentives. But we look also at alternatives. For example, might it be that the statutes did not deliver because corporate leaders needed to gain shareholder vote of approval? We find this is not plausible because we show that protections were largely absent, even in the subset of deals where this wasn't a constraint because the premium was large and the approval was approved by a very large margin over what was required. And in any event, shareholders' exclusive voting power should also be expected to constrain the ability of stakeholderism to deliver value. An alternative explanation, and Colin in his recent response to our paper that people who are interested in the subject might want to read, he wonders whether we can learn much from this experience because maybe the failure of the statute was due to the shareholder-focused norms that prevailed in the past, but maybe no longer dominate. But we document that corporate leaders did not deliver any value to stakeholders, not just in prior decades, but also in all the deals in the last 3 to 5 years in which pro-stakeholder rhetoric was very strong. The question then arises, maybe we could fix incentives. We took the existing system of incentives as given for part of our analysis because stakeholderists, and you can look at the Business Roundtable or the Davis Manifesto, you see that they advocate relying on the discretion of corporate leaders without changing other basic corporate law rules like shareholders' voting power. But it might be argued, and then Colin wonders about this in his paper, that even if stakeholderism as currently put forward cannot be expected to benefit stakeholders, we should, as academics, focus on identifying and designing a broad reform, including some supplemental measures that would enable stakeholderism to benefit stakeholders. So in our paper, we conduct an analysis of whether this would happen if we supplemented stakeholderism with either a redesign of pay arrangements by tying them very much to ESG metrics, or by having stakeholders participate in voting on director elections. And we conclude that both types of supplemental measures would be very difficult to implement, would impose large costs, and that the benefits that they would produce for stakeholders would be doubtful and at a minimum limited. So therefore, this leads us to conclude that stakeholders should not proceed with advocating acceptance of stakeholderism until they put forward a concrete plan that would fix those incentive problems. Until now, I focused on explaining why stakeholderism would fail to deliver benefits to the purported beneficiaries, the stakeholders. But some of you might wonder, perhaps it wouldn't, it could only be a plus, maybe it would produce a significant benefit, but it can only move us in a positive direction. And our conclusion is the opposite. We show that acceptance of stakeholderism would produce two major costs. One cost is that stakeholderism should be expected to increase the insulation of corporate leaders from stakeholders and make corporate leaders less accountable. And that can be expected to happen in two ways. First of all, stakeholderism is already used as a basis for urging institutional investors to be more deferential to corporate leaders, less willing to support hedge fund activists, and more accepting of governance arrangements that shield management from shareholder pressure. And also, stakeholderism is used as a basis for urging policymakers to support legal reforms that would insulate corporate leaders from shareholders. Indeed, we are especially concerned about this prospect of insulation because for reasons we describe in the paper, it seems that the prospect of obtaining such insulation might be at least partly motivating the support for stakeholderism that comes from some corporate leaders and their advisors. For them, support for stakeholderism may well be strategic. It's an attempt to take us back to the era of managerialism and to get back a managerialist agenda, but dressed up in the clothes of stakeholder protection. The other large cost that we are concerned about is people like Colin or ourselves, politicians all over the world. There's a growing recognition that corporate externalities are meaningful, and there is substantial and growing demand for policies, laws, regulations that would address those problems. And we argue that the wide array of potential policy reforms that could be imposed on corporations from the outside and that would provide real benefits to stakeholderism, those could be somewhat discouraged or impeded or chilled by acceptance of stakeholderism. And that could result for two reasons. First of all, that to the extent that the acceptance of stakeholderism leads to illusory hopes that corporate leaders are going to protect stakeholders on their own, then those expectations could have two adverse consequences. One is they would reduce the effort of those who care about stakeholders to focus on external regulation. And also it would make many lawmakers and policy makers less receptive to such external constraints on grounds that let's first see whether private ordering and corporate leaders on their own are solving the problems. To illustrate, A recent statement by dozens of academics that you can find on SSRN argues, among other things, that with less than a decade left in which to address the catastrophic threat of climate change, and with many having a shared sense of urgency, now is the time to act to reform corporate governance. And we strongly disagree, even though we share this sense of urgency, because we believe that those who share this sense of urgency should be focused on things like, say, carbon tax that could make a difference. And if they focus on reforming corporate governance, and especially on advancing stakeholderism, we are going to find ourselves in 10 years kind of excessively close and having missed some opportunities to address this catastrophic threat. Let me just add maybe a couple of notes to put this, our work in perspective. We do not focus on this in this paper, but I plan to do it in subsequent work, on the extent to which shareholders and institutional investors should be guided in their stewardship by attempts to induce companies to provide benefits to stakeholders. And there is, as you know, a lot of work on this question. For our purposes, we take as given that it is desirable, either because the shareholders want it or because it's important for society, to improve the protection of stakeholders. Our problem is that stakeholderism is not the way to go about achieving this outcome, whether it's one that stakeholders, whether it's one that institutional investors desire or society. And although we do not analyze directly ESG-focused stewardship, our conclusions have clear implications for this stewardship, namely, to the extent that institutional investors want to advance stakeholder interests, perhaps pressing some particular specific actions might produce such benefits, but supporting stakeholderism or supporting statements of corporate purpose or pursuing anything else in the form of stakeholderism that in the end relies on the discretion of corporate leaders to deliver the goods is not going to be an effective way to do so. Maybe let me also make a very quick note to place our work in the context of the substantial debate on the social responsibility of business in connection with the 50th anniversary of Milton Friedman's seminal essay. So we very much differ from Friedman's inclination and attitude because we view corporate externalities on stakeholders as a first-order concern. He does not seem to be greatly concerned about this issue. But even though we view the current consequences of capitalism differently from him, we do not want to change capitalism in the way of giving corporate leaders discretion to mitigate the problems that it arises. What we would like is to constrain capitalism from the outside through external rules and regulations.
Around 5 minutes left.
Sure, I just used 2 of them. Thanks, Bo. We recognize that part of the appeal of stakeholderism is that it seemingly provides a quote-unquote private ordering solution to the problems of capitalism, it seems to harness corporations, which have been a powerful engine of economic growth, to the benefit of stakeholders. But corporations have been successful in their economic missions due to their incentives of the corporate leaders, and relying on corporate leaders to produce societal benefits for which we don't really have right now a plan to provide them in incentives to do so, while weakening the incentives that have enabled them to work well in other areas. That's not the way to go. So let me conclude by just reminding you of our two main points, that the benefits of stakeholderism are illusory, because benefits for stakeholders should not be expected to arise, and that the potential costs of stakeholderism, including for the protection of stakeholders themselves, are large indeed. Thank you both. I yield the rest of my time.
Yes, thank you. The discussant is Colin Mayer. Colin, will you share slides as well? Okay, wait, you're muted. Let's unmute.
No, I'm not going to use any slides.
Perfect.
Thank you very much, Bo. My good friend Lucian and I have already debated this fascinating paper at great length. It's an excellent oversight and summary of the issues in the debate on stakeholders and shareholders. So, to avoid boring my friends frequently say that is exactly what I do. That's why they are my friends. I'll not repeat my previous comments, but restrict myself to some new ones. So how should one judge whether the promotion of stakeholder interests beyond shareholder interests is beneficial? The conventional way is to look at the impact on a company's share price and return to shareholders. For example, there's much evidence of a positive association between employee satisfaction and share prices, as reported, for example, by Alex Edmonds and Jan-Emmanuel Denner. The absence of such a positive relation would be interpreted by critics of stakeholder theories as evidence of a failure of stakeholder interests to deliver beneficial outcomes. And a positive relation is interpreted by critics like Lucian as evidence that it is no more than enlightened shareholder interest. Heads, you win; tails, I lose. So what evidence can be elicited to demonstrate that the promotion of stakeholder interests is desirable? This raises the question of what we're actually trying to do and how we should judge success. As I'll describe it, it's a question that Lucian's paper never addresses, let alone answers. So unfortunately, this paper, fascinating though it is devoid of either conceptual or empirical content. The evidence on the failure of the Business Roundtable signatories to uphold their promises is, even according to Lucian's interpretation, not remotely surprising. My interpretation of the Business Roundtable statement from the outset was that it was, in Lucian's terms, enlightened shareholder interest, and I explicitly heard many members describe it at a meeting of their CEOs and chairs as reflecting what that business guru Jim Collins described as being the genius of the end, looking after their stakeholders and creating long-term value for their shareholders. They saw no trade-off and saw their role as remaining within the confines of shareholder primacy while reinforcing their commitment to their stakeholders in so doing. So they saw no need to consult their boards, change their governance statements on their websites, or shift their state of incorporation from Delaware. So what should one conclude from this? Well, I think the answer is not much, because all that it demonstrates is that shareholder primacy reigns supreme in the US. And one doesn't change an economic system by simply announcing one's going to change one's behavior. Is that news? Not really. Is that interesting? Not a great deal. And Lucian himself provides persuasive evidence on why this should not come as any surprise. Directors and CEOs that support shareholder interests are more likely to keep their jobs and get new ones. They are less likely to be subject to proxy fights, hostile takeover bids, hedge fund activist interventions, and therefore loss of their jobs and salary. CEOs' salaries are much more closely tied to share prices and returns than any non-financial measure. In a shareholder primacy system, the shareholder who pays the piper calls the shareholder value tune. The system is stacked against directors and CEOs trying to do anything else. And the failure of constituency statutes to provide protection to stakeholders in private equity acquisitions of companies incorporated in constituency statute states says no more than the inadequacy of constituency statutes to offer effective protection in an economy where shareholder primacy reigns supreme. And it's not surprising when you look at the statutes. Take this one from Minnesota, which reads as follows. A director may, in considering the best interests of the corporation, consider the interests of the corporation's employees, customers, suppliers, and creditors, the economy of the state and nation, community, and societal considerations, and the long-term as well as short-term interests of the corporation and its shareholders, including the possibility that these interests might be best served by the continuing independence of the corporation. What sort of a commitment device is that? Apart from being verbiage, it sounds pretty close to the UK Companies Act, and indeed any shareholder or enlightened shareholder interest law. And notice that the statement at the beginning is may. There's no obligation whatsoever. It's not a must. May is mush. Must might have cast some muster. Lucian argues that it's impossible to change the system, and in particular to relate incentives to non-financial measures of performance. That's a curious statement from someone sitting in one of the strongest incentive-driven academic institutions in the world, where all of the metrics on which it's based are non-financial. Of course, he'll argue that business is different, only it isn't. Anyone who's worked in a business knows that the vast proportion of the metrics by which people's performance are judged are non-financial. Sales, customer satisfaction, collegiality, teamsmanship, etc. Lucian talks about climate and the fact that there are many ways of measuring a company's impact, CO2 emissions, global warming. But those are exactly the measures against which increasingly financial institutions managing not just one company, but multiple companies are being evaluated. They in turn will put increasing pressure on companies to do the same and exercise their business judgment in making the resulting trade-offs. Finally, he argues this is all just a smokescreen, a diversionary tactic for avoiding what really would help stakeholders, namely regulation. But what world is Lucian living in? If regulation could and had internalized externalities, do we really think that we'd be fretting about climate change, diversity, and inclusion? Does he recognize the problems that the globalization of companies such as Google and Facebook presents for designing effective regulation? The illusion is not one of the potential for reform, but the potential for the absence of reform and relying on the status quo. What the paper entirely fails to do is to provide any evidence on the potential for change and the fact that there are very different systems around the world that promote very different types of corporate conduct and balances of interest in companies. But it's not just that the paper provides no evidence on the question that needs to be answered. Still more seriously, it suggests no way of evaluating whether such a change is desirable. What is good for Lucian? He clearly is genuinely concerned about stakeholder as well as shareholder interests, but he offers no way of judging whether the shareholder primacy model with regulation delivers that. And many people think it doesn't and believe that other systems could do better. And with good reason, because corporations are products of the law and therefore can be created in whatever form the law wishes them to take. The fact that it's perfectly possible to establish publicly promoting corporations is evidenced by the fact that that is exactly how they were constituted and operated for several centuries around the world, including in the US, as documented at the beginning of Lucian and Roberto's paper. The question is not whether it's possible, but whether it's desirable. And on this, the paper has nothing to say because it provides no criteria by which to judge this. There's nothing in the paper that speaks about the feasibility of another system or provides a basis on which to judge whether another system does better. Is it shareholder wealth, total wealth, shareholder welfare, total welfare? This paper is simply a description of the existing US system and a presumption, but with no evidence, that it could not be bettered. He could do better. We can do better. And we must do better because we almost certainly will need to do so very soon. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So if I follow that correctly, you don't agree with everything Lucian said. So let's give Lucian a chance to discuss this. We have about 6 minutes or maybe a few more, and there are a couple of questions in the Q&A. So you decide, Lucian, how much time you want to spend on Colin, and if you want, I will read you questions from the Q&A.
Sure. Yeah, thanks a lot, Bo, and thanks, Colin, for your comments, which as usual are delivered with a great eloquence. A quick reaction. There was a lot in what you said. One is we don't say what is our objective or we might be focusing on shareholder value. No, we try to make it clear, and let me state it here, that we start from the assumption that it's important to protect the interest of stakeholders. You can think about us as being in economics a social player who wants to have a system that maximizes social welfare. So in that we are with you. But the question is, how do we maximize social welfare? And I agree with you that we can design corporate law rules any way we want, but it doesn't follow that the way to maximize social welfare is to tell corporate leaders, you'll be the benevolent dictator and we give you discretion and we count on you to maximize social welfare. Secondly, you agreed with us that maybe not much should have been expected from the Business Roundtable. I note here that there was a massive number of observers, which we cite, that regarded this as a major historic milestone. So at least for them, our evidence might be helpful. But your view was, look, the BRT, the constituency statutes, I'm not surprised. They're not going to deliver because there isn't anything tight there. There is a lot of mush and people don't have incentives. And here we completely agree with you. The problem is that when I look at the literature of the people who put forward stakeholderism, including your own valuable work, it's not clear to me that the system you provide at this point does not suffer from those problems. Is it having corporations articulate a corporate purpose by which the public might judge them? Is that going to provide a tight constraint. You mentioned that we haven't shown that it's not possible to design a good stakeholderism system. We have tried in our paper to see whether you can do it through changing the voting rules and compensation. But I actually urge you, Colin, as someone who believes in stakeholderism, is why don't you put forward a concrete, detailed plan of how you get stakeholderism to work in a way that is grounded in incentive and is tied in the ways that you as an economist recognize is necessary to deliver its benefits. And once you have such a plan, we can think about it. And even though we haven't been able to come up with one, surely it might be possible. We are not excluding it. And once you have a plan, we'll look at it and we'll think about it. But what I urge you, because of the large costs of the illusory hopes, is not to push stakeholderism until you have the kind of plan that seems to be necessary based on your own comments for those things to work. And the last two reactions, let me just, the last two reactions are the following. You mentioned, the one concrete proposal you mentioned was, let's use ESG metrics. We put in the paper several reasons why it's very difficult to do it with ESG metrics. We know, many of the people in this conference have worked on executive compensation. We know how difficult it is to design perfectly executive compensation, even for the simple objective of shareholder value. With respect to stakeholder metrics, there is first of all the problem of the multitude of stakeholders and combining them. And secondly, there is the problem of managers' private interest, which may mean that we have to worry that whoever is designing those metrics is not going to do it to benefit managers' payoffs, but rather to protect stakeholders. And as long as so we need two things. One is good set of metrics, and two, a good system for overseeing the design of those compensation arrangements based on metrics. And we conclude in the paper that both things are very difficult. If you come up with a plan, it would be great. Last comment and a quick reaction. You, as well as others, are kind of concerned about the fact that we have political gridlock and some things are difficult to get through regulation. And you say various companies are fighting against regulation and there are vested interests in a way. And there's a little bit of a tension in this argument. Why? Because the very corporate leaders who are spending massive corporate resources to fight against regulation, you would like to count on their discretion to protect stakeholders. The two things do not live with each other well. And we also recognize that politics is a difficult route. But our conclusions about stakeholderism are that this is the only route that can provide meaningful progress. And we do have some laws and regulations in each of those areas, not enough, I agree with you, but we have them on the books. And the chances of us making progress in this direction might be chilled if people come to the view that we can rely on corporate leaders, or at least we should give a chance for stakeholderism to deliver benefits in the next 10, 20 years before we take other action to save the planet, combat inequality, and so forth. Let me stop here.
Well, Lucien, we have set out a specific plan in the British Academy Future the Corporation Programme, which sets out what one's trying to do and how one gets there. And it's around the notion of corporate purposes as solving problems in profitable ways. And the measures for doing that are not the current ESG. Everyone recognizes the deficiency with those. What is being designed at present is a set of coherent measures that can be adopted by companies that would not be at their discretion as to what they choose to do. And secondly, to design an accounting system. And you say, well, it's impossible to do that. People were saying exactly the same thing about the introduction of a financial accounting system after the great crash at the beginning of the 1930s. It will happen, and it has to happen. And furthermore, it's not a matter of regulation having been watered down by the corporate sector. It's a matter of aligning interests of corporations so that the regulations that are put in place are those that promote purposes that are societally focused on those companies where it's appropriate to do so. Other companies should be able to choose their purpose.
Yes, just a quick reaction, if Bo will allow me. If the concrete plan is the one that is in your writings about corporate purpose and in the project of the British Academy, then my own concern, and this is something we can conclude later and perhaps we should add to our paper as well, my own concern is that what we have there does not enjoy advantages over what the constituency statutes try to do, and does not overcome the problem that you recognized before about incentives, about mushiness, about people trying to get away with sounding good, but not really sacrificing much. My own research, and I'll stop here because maybe there are questions we can is I've looked at the various companies that have adopted corporate purpose, and it's complete mush. Those statements generally do not provide a good yardstick that would enable us to keep corporate leaders' feet to the fire. Now, I'm sure that the project of the British Academy is also unhappy about the current mushy statements, would want to have statements that would be more effectively scrutinized from the outside. So once we'll have a system that makes it completely necessary for people to have statements that can be externally from the outside scrutinized in a way that would make them accountable and provide them with clear incentives to do it. Currently, with deference to your work on this, I'm not persuaded the project of the British Academy can deliver us to the Garden of Eden of stakeholder protection.
Well, it can go a long way if you simply in corporate law replace may with must, and you measure outcomes not by the mushiness of the statement, but by the
Here,
and measure that before.
We have two.
Let me just say one bit. As a law professor, this is the one where if you just replace in the constituency statutes the word may with the word shall or ought or must, it would not have made any difference for two reasons. One, there are 3 statutes, as we mentioned in the paper, that have those words, no difference. And two, because of the way that courts defer to what managers decide, those things are aspirational. They are not enforceable, whether you say may or must. Those are aspirational and norm setting. So you can say may, must, or even any stronger term in the English language, it would not have made a difference. And indeed, in the 3 states that have this word, no difference in outcomes. Let me stop here.
So this reminds me of what happens when I tell my students that they must prepare some text before class the next day. It kind of works on some, but not on others. Sorry, on a more serious note, I want to thank you both for a very interesting and lively discussion. It has been great to have you here. We ate up the break. So if Ian is ready, I want to hand over to the next paper right away with no Q&A and no further discussion. Although perhaps there's the opportunity to discuss these issues and Lucian's paper in other contexts. The next paper will be presented by Ian Apple and is co-authored work with Pat Akey, who maybe is also here, and it's called Environmental Externalities of Activism. And you now have 30 minutes.
All right, thank you so much, Bo. So like Bo said, this is joint work with Pat Akey. And before I get started, I just want to say we're in the middle of revising the paper now. It's still very much a work in progress. And so we really do appreciate Jill's thoughts on the paper as well as any from the audience. Now, in this paper, we're studying the effect of activist investors on environmental behaviors. One thing I just want to make clear from the get-go is we're specifically looking at activist hedge funds who buy stakes in firms and usually make some sort of a governance intervention in the hopes of increasing the share price. We are not analyzing the behavior of investors who primarily have ESG goals. Oh, let me make this full screen, sorry. All right, so obviously, as Lucian was just discussing, there's been this emphasis on stakeholderism in recent years. And this emphasis has come from large institutional investors like BlackRock, business groups like the Business Roundtable, as well as policymakers. Now, an important idea underlying this discussion is that there's this conflict between stakeholders and shareholders of a firm. Now, the extent to which this conflict exists is subject to some debate amongst economists. And so, for instance, here's a poll from the IGM Forum. And so it's a poll by Chicago Booth of a bunch of high-profile economists. And back in September of 2019, the poll asked if having companies run to maximize shareholder value creates significant negative externalities for workers and communities. And we see here that over 40% of the respondents either agreed or strongly agreed with this statement. But actually the modal response here was that people are uncertain, and about 16% of respondents disagreed with this statement. And so we see a wide range of responses to this particular question. Now, an interesting thing about these IGM polls is that you can drill down and see individual responses here. And so one of the main trends that emerges, if you look at these responses, is that people say, well, to the extent that there are negative externalities stemming from this idea of shareholder wealth maximization, pollution is probably one case where we would expect to see this. And so, for instance, Darren Asamoglu talks about how polluting might increase shareholder value, but come at considerable social cost. Daryl Duffy points out, well, this is in fact why we have things like environmental regulations. And then Michael Greenstone says, well, if we think about the effect of wealth maximization on stakeholders, there's probably going to be positive spillovers, things like agglomeration, and there might be negative ones as well, for which pollution is an example. And so when we first started working on this paper, sort of the broad question we had in mind was, to what extent do shareholder and stakeholder governance conflict? Now, we're specifically going to be thinking about this question in the context of firms' environmental behaviors. That is, how much emissions does a firm produce? And as I mentioned before, we're going to be studying this in the context of activist hedge fund campaigns. Now, as I mentioned, the reason why we're looking at activist hedge funds is that they're widely regarded as being profit-motivated investors. And so this is in contrast to other types of investors like pension funds or endowments that we usually think of as having alternative goals potentially as well. And there's lots of evidence consistent with this idea that shareholder activism is associated with positive abnormal returns. What we want to think about is, well, to what extent do these returns potentially come at the expense of other stakeholders, particularly those stakeholders that are affected by environmental behaviors? Now, there's a very straightforward story that I mentioned where we can think about why activism might be bad for the environment. It could be that an activist comes in and they cut back on, say, pollution abatement investment because this will increase profitability for a firm, perhaps firm value as well. And this in turn benefits the activist. More formally, we can think about this as potentially activism campaigns facilitate the breach of implicit contracts between a firm and its stakeholders. This is an idea that goes back at least to the late 80s. Schleifer and Summers talked about this in the context of buyouts and employee pension funds. And they argue that, well, potentially buyouts facilitate value redistribution from stakeholders to shareholders rather than value creation. And indeed, there's some empirical evidence consistent with this idea. Pontiff, Schleifer, and Weisbach say that, well, at least part of the gains from buyouts comes from this sort of redistribution. This is an idea that's been talked about recently, even by some managers of activist hedge funds. And so Jeff Ubben, who used to run Value Act, a big activist in San Francisco, talks about that as companies as governed today, with investors asking for more current returns and more buybacks and so forth, aren't working for society or nature. Now, we can also think about reasons why potentially activism campaigns might have a positive effect on firms' environmental behaviors. And so one reason is that, well, maybe activists just care about a firm's environmental behaviors, and they might do so for either financial or non-financial reasons. And there's some anecdotal evidence, in fact, suggesting that when an activist takes a stake in a position, they take some actions in order to affect environmental behaviors. Cliff Robbins, who runs Blue Harbor, talks about how ESG is hugely important, and they put it on the same scale as other things that they look at when they're making an investment, including a firm's cash flow, market share, and its management. And the reason for this, he argues, is that, well, this is simply in terms of risk management. Anything that they can do to reduce risk is smart. An article from the Wall Street Journal back in March gave other examples of activists going into a firm and taking actions to potentially directly affect aspects of environmental behaviors. And so the article mentioned Elliott issuing a letter to Evergy, telling the company to reduce its carbon footprint, or third point, highlighting the excessive carbon footprint for Prudential from having a London headquarters for American and Asian businesses. And so one possibility is that activists affect environmental behaviors through this direct channel. That is, they address environmental behaviors when they take a position in a stock. However, we can also think about potentially indirect reasons why activism might affect environmental behaviors. And so if you think about, well, what does the research say about where do the gains from activism come from? One finding in the literature is that campaigns are associated with operational improvements. And so, for instance, Bravjag and Kim point out that, well, after an activist comes in, there's an increase in the productivity of assets in place, as well as more efficient capital reallocation. Bravjag, Ma, and Tian make a similar point in that, well, when an activist comes in, we see R&D becoming more efficient. That is, firms spend less on R&D, but in fact, patenting goes up. And so an additional possibility here is that, all right, well, if firms are becoming more operationally efficient, for instance, maybe an activist comes in and streamlines some aspect of the production process, this may in fact lead to environmental efficiency. And so you can sort of think about this as, well, maybe activists aren't directly targeting environmental behaviors, but it could be that these other improvements that they're making to a firm have this sort of spillover effect to environmental behaviors. All right, so just to sort of walk you through our main findings in this paper, we find that activism campaigns are associated with a sizable effect on emissions. Specifically, we see a decrease of roughly 17% in emissions after an activist campaign. We find that this effect is primarily driven by campaigns that focus on either general objectives, that is, an activist comes in and says, well, our main goal is to increase shareholder value, or campaigns where the activist specifically targets aspects of a firm's operations. Now, of course, we can't make a causal claim here. Activism campaigns aren't randomly assigned, but it does appear that we're not just picking up some sort of underlying trend when it comes to a firm's emissions. In terms of why do we see this change in emissions, we find evidence that the change is driven by a drop in production for a firm. We don't see any changes in abatement activities. And so this seems to suggest that the primary channel operating here isn't necessarily that direct effect. That is, it doesn't appear that activists are directly coming in and trying to target environmental behaviors. Rather, we interpret the evidence as saying, well, this is potentially a consequence of other things that an activist is doing that affect production of the firm. And finally, we find some evidence consistent with the idea that this drop in emissions has positive spillovers for other stakeholders. In particular, we find that there's a decrease in chemicals that cause harm to humans. So this effect isn't just being driven by inert chemicals. And we also find evidence in a drop in the likelihood of EPA enforcement. And so to the extent that the EPA enforcement targets behaviors that are costly for other stakeholders, this also suggests positive spillovers. And so overall, we think our findings highlight this idea that operational improvements stemming from activism campaigns potentially benefit other stakeholders of the firm. All right, so let me walk you through the data we're using in this project. We have toxic emissions from the EPA. This is called the TRI database. And this gives very granular data for emissions. Specifically, we have the pounds of ground, water, and air emissions at the chemical level for each plant in our sample. One thing to note is that this data is self-reported. Misreporting is subject to criminal and civil penalties, however. And it's also important to note that under the TRI, there's no penalties for reporting a large number for emissions. The only penalties are for misreporting emissions. What are the plants in the sample? Plants are required to report to the TRI database if they employ more than 10 people, use a meaningful quantity of one of 600 different chemicals. And so the cutoff for different chemicals are different based on things like toxicity, and if the plant operates in particular industries. And so this database gives us the parent company for each plant, and we use this to match to the targets of activism campaigns. Just to get a sense for what kind of plants we have here, they're primarily manufacturing plants. And so the largest categories include things like chemical manufacturing or transportation manufacturing. In addition to this, there's things like utilities and waste management plants as well. In addition to the main data on emissions at the plant chemical level, we also have information on abatement activities. And so this is also at the plant chemical level from the EPA's P2 database. And so here, facilities need to report abatement actions across 7 different categories. And so the most common are good operating practices. That is, if a particular plant took actions to reduce emissions via these sorts of practices, or things like process modifications. And so we can use this database to create an indicator, again, at the plant chemical level, for whether a particular abatement action is taken. And then finally, we have a measure of production from the same database. And so here, plants are required to report a production ratio. And so this is the ratio for whatever chemical was used to do or produce for this year relative to last year. And so, for instance, if a chemical is being used to manufacture refrigerators, the production ratio tells us refrigerators produced for this year relative to last year. Now, one important thing to note is that it's not necessarily, the production ratio doesn't necessarily capture the final output of the plant. And so if a chemical is being used in sort of an intermediary process, for instance, to clean machines, then the production ratio for that particular chemical would be machines cleaned this year relative to last year. Just a few summary statistics. The main thing I want to point out here is that in our data, most of the emissions, so for most chemicals, there are air emissions. Water emissions or ground emissions are less common. However, if we condition on positive emissions, then we see that, in fact, ground emissions are quite large, while air and water tend to be a bit smaller. We use hedge fund activism data from Brav, Jag, and Kim. This is an updated sample of campaigns going through 2015. Campaigns are primarily from 13D filings, and so these are mandatory filings for when an investor takes a 5% stake and wants to influence some aspect of corporate behavior. We exclude passive campaigns where there doesn't seem to be any indication of activism from our sample. We look at those in the paper in sort of unreported analysis. In total, we have 218 campaigns that we can match to the EPA data. These 218 campaigns target over 1,300 plants and over 5,000 plant chemicals. And then here's just the time series of campaigns that we have in our sample. And this matches sort of the general trend of activism campaigns if you look at sort of the broad universe. Campaigns are rare in the 1990s. However, we see this sort of build up into the mid-2000s, and they stay at an elevated level after that. In addition, if we look at the cars for the campaigns in our sample, this also matches what you see for the broader sample of activism campaigns. We see cars of around 5% or so. All right, so here's the main regression specification we're going to be looking at. The main outcome we're interested in is the amount of pollution. So we measure this as the log of the pounds of pollution. And again, pollution is measured at the chemical plant level. We have an activism variable. This is an indicator that turns on in the year of an activism campaign. And so this is defined at the parent company level. And this indicator stays on for 4 years following the campaign. In our specification, we also include plant chemical fixed effects, as well as chemical by year fixed effects. And so these chemical year fixed effects will help to control for any sort of time varying heterogeneity at the chemical level. And so, for instance, if there's some sort of regulation that affects the use of a chemical, this is something that helps us to control for that. And then in other specifications, we include things like industry by year fixed effects to control for industry trends. And so we have a very granular definition of industries that we use here using a 6-digit NICE code. And then also in some specifications, we'll include state by year fixed effects to try to control for things like local economic conditions. All right, so let's jump into the results. We start out by sort of studying the question of what is the relationship between activism campaigns and emissions. We're going to mostly focus on the intensive margin of emissions, but we'll look at the extensive margin here as well. So first, in terms of the intensive margin, here again, our main outcome variable is the log of the total pounds of emissions. And across our different specifications here, we see that there's a negative relationship between activism campaigns and emissions. In the first column, we're using plant chemical fixed effects. Again, remember our data is at the plant chemical level, as well as chemical year fixed effects. In column 2, we add industry by year fixed effects. In column 3, we also add state by year fixed effects. And so across all of these estimates, we see that the specifications produce broadly consistent results, fairly stable results, where there's a drop of between 16 and approximately 19% in emissions at the chemical level. If we look at the dynamics around activism campaigns, we don't see any evidence that we're just picking up some sort of underlying decrease in emissions at the chemical level. Rather, it appears that there's this sharp decrease in emissions once an activist initiates a campaign, and then emissions stay low in the following 4 years. As I mentioned, we also look at the extensive margin of emissions. And so here we use an indicator for whether a plant stops using a chemical. And we see that there's an increase in the likelihood of stopping to use a particular chemical. That is, a chemical doesn't appear any longer in the TRI database. These specifications are the same as the previous slide. And the economic magnitudes here are relatively large. It's about 5 percentage points, which is a decrease of almost 2/3 relative to the sample mean in the likelihood of stopping to use a particular chemical. I'm not going to show you the results here, but we also find evidence that firms are less likely to start using new chemicals. And so we also see an effect on emissions along the extensive margin here. We can look at different types of emissions. And we see that we see a similar negative effect for air, water, and ground emissions, although the effect seems to be strongest here for air emissions, which, as I mentioned before, this is the most common type of emissions in the TRI database. Next, we think about which campaigns are driving the effects here. And so we separately estimate these regressions by campaign objective. And one thing to note, campaign objectives are not mutually exclusive, so they add up to more than 100%. The categories here are whether a campaign targets business strategy, some aspect of corporate governance, the sale of the target firm, capital structure, or whether campaigns just sort of have a general objective with the goal of improving shareholder value. And when we separate these different objectives, we find that the results are driven by the general category of campaigns or those that target aspects of business strategy. We don't see any effect for campaigns that have the primary objectives related to governance, sale of the target, or the target's capital structure. And so one way to think about these findings is that, well, the results tend to concentrate in a subset of campaigns that plausibly have some effect on the target's operations, that aren't targeting, say, the dividend payout policy or trying to sell the target. All right, next we think about the channel. That is, what drives this change in environmental behavior stemming from activism campaigns? First, we ask, well, okay, does this drop in emissions stem from changes in pollution abatement? And so it could be, for instance, that an activist wants to engage in more abatement activities in order to mitigate some sort of long-term regulatory risk. And we're going to analyze this using the EPA's P2 database that I mentioned before. Next, we consider, okay, well, does the change in emissions stem from some change related to production? And so in order to analyze this, we'll use the production ratio in order to shed light on this potential channel. First, we don't find evidence of changes related to abatement activities. And so we construct a bunch of different variables here. And so remember, we have indicator variables for 7 different types of abatement. In the first 3 columns here, we're looking at an indicator for whether a firm engages in any type of abatement. And again, this variable is defined at the plant chemical level. We can also look at the number of abatement actions taken. And so that's what we're doing in columns 4 through 6. And then in unreported analysis, we also look at specific types of abatement. Now, across all of these different measures, we don't really see any evidence that activism campaigns are associated with changes in abatement activities. If anything, the coefficients we estimate here are negative, but they're not statistically different from 0. And so overall, we don't find any evidence indicating that there's changes in abatement activities that might lead to this drop in emissions. Next, we turn attention to production. And so if you'll remember before, the TRI database gives us this production ratio, which tells us the quantity produced for this year relative to last year. Now, we also construct a measure of sort of cumulative production. So this is going to give us a measure of the level of production rather than the growth rate of production. And we do this simply by normalizing the first year that we have data for to 1, and essentially growing this forward using the production ratio. And so we find evidence using both of these measures of changes in production. And so in the first 3 columns here, we're looking at the production ratio, again, defined at the plant chemical level. And we see evidence of a drop in production of about 2.7%. We find qualitatively similar results if we instead look at the level of production, that is where we grow it forward. And so we look at the log of the level of production, and we see a decrease here of roughly 8 to 10%. And so we think that this evidence indicates that while potentially this drop in emissions is coming from changes related to operations that ultimately affect production at the plant chemical level. We can also analyze a measure of the efficiency of emissions. That is, what is the pollution per unit of production? And so here we create this variable where we take our emissions at the plant level, the plant chemical level, and divide this by our measure of production. And here we see some evidence that activism campaigns are associated with the drop in emissions per unit of production. In the first column here, we use our specification with plant chemical fixed effects. We see that the result gets slightly weaker, both in terms of economic magnitude and statistical significance, as we start controlling for more heterogeneity here. But it's important to note that both of these measures that we're using to construct this measure are relatively noisy. So, like I said, this is
Ian, are you aware that you're coming up on your time limit soon?
Okay, I can finish up in 2 minutes.
Perfect, thank you.
So let me just say, like I said, we're still thinking about aspects of this project. And one question in particular we're thinking through now is, well, why do we see this change in production? As I noted before, this isn't necessarily capturing the final output of the plant. I will say a couple of things that we've looked at recently. We don't see any evidence of, for instance, of shipping production overseas, perhaps to more pollution-friendly jurisdictions. We don't see any evidence of a change in sales at either the plant or the firm level. Though we do see some evidence of changes in product market fluidity, that is, in terms of what plants are actually producing, which potentially explains at least part of what's going on here. All right, and the final thing I want to note is we find some evidence consistent with the idea of spillovers that potentially affect stakeholders. In particular, if we look at hazardous chemicals, we see that there's specifically a drop in chemicals that cause harm to humans. In addition to this, we see evidence of changes in EPA enforcement. That is, there's a drop in the likelihood of enforcement, as well as a drop in fines paid by firms. And this effect is mostly driven by the Clean Air Act, which is consistent with our emissions result being driven by a drop primarily in air emissions. All right, so just to wrap up here, we're thinking about the effect of activism campaigns on environmental behaviors. We find these campaigns are associated with a drop in emissions. And overall, we think these findings highlight the idea that operational improvements resulting from activism campaigns potentially have benefits to other stakeholders. Thank you very much.
Thanks. The discussant is Jill Fish. And if we have a little bit of time at the end, I will try to read out some questions. So all participants are free to type in questions in the Q&A and also vote for other people's questions if there's a question you like. All right. Thank you, Jill.
Great. Can you hear me and see my slides? Excellent. So thank you for the opportunity to be here. I'm sorry it's here in Pennsylvania and not in Sweden, but it's a fascinating paper and an even better presentation. And I really like the direction that you guys are going in, and I really appreciated the context that you put the paper in. So I think that's super helpful. So let's see if I can get this to go. Okay, great. So just very quickly, right, this paper also fits really well with the discussion in the previous session between Colin and Lucian, right? So you've got this debate over shareholder activism. As background, that's Marty Lipton. Marty Lipton says there's no long-term value to activist attacks. Lucian, right, yes, he was here, but I figured I'd make sure he was here. Lucian says, yes, shareholder interventions are actually produce both short and long-term value. And the sort of new feature of this debate that's been ongoing for a long time is stakeholder capitalism, right? So that's the Business Roundtable statement, and Business Roundtable says we share a fundamental commitment, not just to shareholders, but to all of our stakeholders, and we can go back and forth on exactly whether that is a commitment and what it means. But this paper says, okay, let's take this theory seriously, and let's use this theory as a way of trying to assess the value specifically that activists might provide, not just to shareholders, but to this broader group of stakeholders, right? And, motivating question of the project very briefly, how do activist campaigns affect the interests of non-shareholder stakeholders? Evidence shows that they lead both to a reduction in emissions and possibly to more efficient productivity. And we can talk a little bit more about that. So the broad conclusion: benefits, some empirical evidence that activism does provide benefits to stakeholders, and perhaps, bottom line policy implication, let's not be quite as quick to criticize or condemn shareholder activism. So key contributions of the paper, right? First of all, new data, creative use of publicly available data. I wish empirical projects would do more of this, but particularly when we're looking at ESG and stakeholders and so forth, there's a range of data out there that researchers aren't using, data that for independent reasons, and the authors do a really good job of explaining why this data, we should trust them. This is reliable. This is different from looking at pollution data in a company sustainability report. There are a variety of other things that we could use to do a similar analysis. So for example, the EEOC collects a lot of employment data on, pay ratios, on diversity, on employment practices, on job retention that might help us evaluate the effect of activism on employee stakeholders, compliance filings by financial institutions, consumer reports. How do we evaluate the effect of activism on consumers? So I think this is a really promising project, but I think there's a lot more that can be done, and I applaud this project for taking us in this direction. Obviously, it's also really interesting to think about, well, let's evaluate shareholder activism, not just in that same debate, is it good for shareholders, is it bad for shareholders, but how does it affect other stakeholders? So we've seen lots of empirical papers on hedge fund activism. This is really a new direction. Finally, really careful attention to the mechanism, right? And, I tend to fault finance papers for just looking at the bottom line number, but not trying really to analyze how did we get there. I think the authors do a really good job. And in particular, is this about production changes or abatement? And is this efficiency gains? How does this relate to the plant's overall productivity? So I think all of this is really exciting. I have a couple of questions, and they're not criticisms. It's a work in progress. They're questions. They're things that I hope the authors will address more, but they certainly don't take away from my general support for the paper. So first of all, the sample's pretty small. It's pretty small, not in overall size, but in the percentage of activist events that it represents. And that's just, that's the nature of the data. There are just not that many companies that have to report this kind of pollution data. But 218 events is a relatively small proportion of overall activist engagements. And I wonder the extent to which this sample is representative, right? Our chemical plants are the kind of companies that do this kind of manufacturing. Are they different? And can we really infer, from time to time, the paper makes broad conclusions about activism. I'm just not entirely sure about the connection. I'd like to see the authors address that point a little more carefully. Second, can we learn a little bit more about the mechanism, not from the plant side, but from the activism side? So there are papers that look at activist campaigns and talk about, well, was the activist successful? At the end of the day, did the activist do what the activist said it was trying to do when it got started? Did the activist get board representation? Is the activity at the plant the results of doing what the activist wanted, or is the plant taking some sort of defensive measures to ward off the activist that maybe have the effect of promoting stakeholder value or reducing harmful emissions? So again, something that I think there is a basis in the existing literature for that could be incorporated here. Third, is this really stakeholder capitalism? So Ian, you mentioned this a little bit in your presentation. There's a lot of at least claim by hedge funds that environmental risk is an important financial risk. We see this in statements. The head of sustainability at Elliott Management came to a program that we had last December, and she was talking about the fact that, all of this stuff matters from an investment perspective. We don't want to invest in a firm that has huge environmental liabilities. We don't want to invest in a firm that has a toxic incident, while we're a big undiversified investor. That's a problem for us. You see this in the SEC's requirements that firms report more about climate change and other kinds of environmental risks, right? The SEC is focused on financial effects, but it sees that connection. And I think with hedge funds, there's even more. I think a firm's attention to environmental or ESG issues might be a signal, might be a marker. Responsive management, hey, this is on everybody's table, on everybody's agenda. A firm that's not paying attention might be problematic, right? And obviously management quality or the potential to improve management quality is one thing that might get a firm involved. So just some things to think about. Finally, and perhaps the issue that I don't find this troubling in the paper, but I find this troubling in the broader stakeholder debate. So the Business Roundtable statement says each of our stakeholders is essential, right? This paper focuses on environmental harm. To what extent is this about increasing overall productivity? And to what extent is this just shifting who benefits? So a lot of activist efforts, and this is actually a criticism of activist efforts, is that they're trying to eliminate older, less profitable operations. They're trying to shift the company's line of business, focus on the products and the services that are most efficient. But this has an effect on other stakeholders. It has an effect on employees, customers, local communities, right? Canadian think tank said after firms were targeted by activists, employment shrunk 20%. So are firms cutting emissions, but also cutting jobs? And what does that mean for the sort of big policy question that you put up front? Is activism good for stakeholders? Right now, I don't know. I mean, nobody's really come up. Lucian raised this issue, but nobody's really come up to my mind with a really good way of weighing or balancing the interests of competing stakeholders, right? That's something that's kind of unsatisfying about the stakeholder debate. But I think it at least bears a little more examination in this paper, right? So, standard activist critique, activists cut costs, they downsize operations, they close plants, and they eliminate R&D. I don't know how much your story is consistent or kind of goes further. And obviously the extent to which you look at productivity, right, in part is an effort to address that. But, a couple of anecdotes, a couple of sort of cases to think about, right? So Trian, hedge fund, targeted DuPont, chemical company, right? I think it's after your sample, but the reason I looked at it, it's the kind of company that I think your sample, includes, right? It cut R&D, right? This is a defensive measure. So ultimately the activist wasn't successful. DuPont cut R&D. It pursued a merger with Dow Chemical, which I suspect would have cut overall use of some chemicals. And it eliminated 10% of its workforce, right? So that's one of the plants that was at least targeted for cutbacks as a result of the activism. Second example, Carl Icahn targeted Xerox, right there, Xerox, right? At his urging, Xerox cut 5,000 jobs, slashed costs, and split the company in two. Starboard targeted Wausau Paper, leading to the closing of Wisconsin paper mill. Well, paper mills paper mills pollute. It was an old paper mill. It probably used a disproportionate amount of bad chemicals. It bankrupted a small town. Starboard also told Wausau to get out of product lines that included toilet paper and paper towels. Those weren't the most efficient ways, according to Starboard, for Wausau to use its productivity, right? So, problem for the town, problem for the mill employees, that's the specific mill that was closed. But there's another group of stakeholders we might think about, and that's customers. And, at least in the last 6 months, that really efficient productivity that Starboard was promoting hasn't been too good for customers who have faced shortages in toilet paper and paper towels. So bottom line, it's a great paper. It's a timely and important topic. It's a great empirical strategy. You're using also really creative tools for sort of doing a nuanced evaluation of firm value. And I think it has important implications. There's all sorts of issues, all sorts of proposals on the regulatory agenda designed to curb shareholder activism. And your paper says, well, hey, let's think about this a little more carefully before we cut something that we haven't fully analyzed from an empirical perspective. So thanks for the opportunity to comment.
Thank you very much, Jill. I used the moderator's privilege to rob us all of the last break. And I feel I can't do that again. And that break that's coming up is supposed to start now, and it's only 5 minutes. So I'm actually going to call it here, although I'm sure there's all kinds of comments on this, and there were interesting questions raised in the Q&A. We will take a 5-minute break, and we'll start again at 4:20 European time. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jill.
Bo, you still there?
I'm here.
Ian, are you still there?
I am here, yes.
So I love this project. So I just
thank you very much for your comments. I completely agree. In terms like we've been thinking about that in particular lately in terms of the EPA penalties and financial risks. If you sort of do a back of the envelope based on the realized EPA penalties that we have, it's hard to square with the idea that this is primarily driven by that, simply because the penalties aren't that large to begin with. And the activist only captures, a relatively small amount of that. But it is hard to rule that out because there could be, very unlikely events that potentially impose huge costs.
Big
that the
tails,
activists
like BP or something, right? Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And so I think that, like, in particular, we can probably only talk about, we can think about measuring it to an extent. But I think that's a fair point. That probably is part of the story here, at least.
Yeah, I don't think any of these comments are problematic for you. I think it mostly has to do with just kind of a mention or an acknowledgement that, that this is a potential issue, and you move on. It doesn't undercut your empirical results.
Yeah, I think so. But I think that is an important point that we should spend more time talking about in the paper for sure.
I mean, the one other thing that you might look at, and it may be too much for this paper, and it may need to be a separate project, but there is EEOC data on jobs and sort of, job cuts and things, general employment data.
Mm-hmm.
And it would be interesting to just incorporate a very crude, not doing the same kind of deep dive, but using something like employment level or change of employment as some sort of control here.
No, that is something we can account. The paper, Alon and Wei have it when they look at the real effects of activism. They do pick up some effect on employment and things like wages, and so that's something we can try to control for. But I think it sort of speaks to your last point there, which is like it is a really complicated story if you're thinking about sort of general welfare effects here. It's hard to sort of make that calculation and conclude, because there's probably some negative effects on stakeholders. We're arguing that, well, maybe all those effects aren't necessarily negative, but what's the overall effect? I think that's a tricky question, but ultimately the most important question, I think, when it comes to activists and ESG.
And there's no reason that this, that one paper should even try to answer that. But I think, there are a couple of places where your language is a little bit broad, and I think it it needs to be just a little bit more clear that you're not trying to answer that bigger question, right? This is kind of a first step.
That's a good point. Pat, did you have anything?
No, I just want to say thanks for a great set of comments, and in particular, we are figuring out sort of the direction for the paper, and in particular your comments on sort of the framing, I think, are actually very much in line with what we were thinking about, but sort of put in a more concise way. So this will be very helpful for us.
Cool, good. Well, your paper is going to get a lot of pickup, not just in finance, but in the law community. So.
Thank you. And then there were a couple of questions actually in chat that I might just take a minute to talk about here. So in particular, Per had asked about to what extent this is coming from plants that are being sold off. And in our current analysis, we're actually not accounting for changes in plant status because we were worried about there being sort of a mechanical effect. If a couple of plants are sold off, this could mechanically decrease emissions. And so we're thinking about sort of looking at these groups of plants a bit separately, but that's sort of not an issue in the current analysis. And Marco had asked if we had any examples of specific changes that could be consistent with the rapid decline in emissions. And on this end, this is, unfortunately, we've not been able to find quite as many anecdotes, although we actually have talked to a hedge fund that is in our sample. I'm not gonna say which one, but we sort of talked about some of the changes that they've made to supply chains. And so that was sort of one of the first order things that they had talked about doing for one of their engagements was changing supply chains. And these would be the types of things that might kick in pretty quickly. But this is still something that we are hoping to provide some more anecdotal evidence for.
And that's a really great idea. And my sense is that a lot of hedge funds now have specific people who are in this space who would be happy to talk to you about how sustainability fits in, and particularly what they're doing and how they're thinking about the environmental issues.
Definitely. Well, and so we were actually fortunate. They reached out to us because they'd seen the paper. So we actually, the person that we spoke to was involved with the media aspect of the company, and she'd been working there for many years, and it was very interesting to see to what extent many of our conjectures about how some of this was thought about in practice was actually quite in line with practice. And I think Bo is telling me it's time to move on.
Yeah, my hand signals are working. Thank you, Pat. Great. So I think that was as someone pointed out in the Q&A, that was a great way to take the break for those who don't need it to grab another cup of coffee. So thank you all again. Last session of the day, we bet, when we put together this online version of the program, we took the bet that there would be appetite for 4 sessions in one afternoon. And it looks like it's working because there's a lot of people online. Today's last paper is, does private equity ownership make firms cleaner? Evidence from the sky. So we're sort of moving from hedge funds to private equity among the different titans of industry. And at a very early time in what's it called, Mountain Time, Carl is going to be the discussant in a little bit. So thank you for being up very early. At least it looks like maybe the sun is up. And the presenters,
it's now rising. I don't want to show the beautiful mountain backdrop. That would make people think of other things they'd like to do on a Friday.
It's about to set in Stockholm. And the presenter is Aymeric Ballon from Wharton. The floor is yours.
Good morning, everyone. I'm a PhD student in finance at Wharton. I would like first to thank the organizer for having my paper in this session. The more I work on this paper, I realize that the role of environmental liability risk is very important. And then I changed the title. So the new title is, does private equity ownership make firms cleaner? The role of environmental liability risk. Let me start this presentation with a motivating fact. There is a reptile that lives in the Texas desert where a firm was about to build a sand mine. This company did everything possible to make sure as few lizards were harmed during the production process. And it happens that this firm is owned by a PE-backed firm. And this is surprising that such a firm behave in such a way, because the way we usually think about private equity firms is different from an owner that care about the well-being of reptile. They are often portrayed as owners that will use financial engineering to extract as much value as possible from their portfolio companies, even if this harms other stakeholders. Elizabeth Warren does not hesitate to compare them as vampires, the idea being that they will buy a company, extract all the wealth from it, and then this will kill it. Therefore, today's research question is, do private equity firms create shareholder value at the expense of society? So this is an old question in corporate finance. People have studied this question through the lens of consumers, governments, and workers. So for instance, people have looked whether private equity firms increase prices, thus harming the well-being of consumers, or change the way firms pay taxes, thus harming governments, or change the wage of the worker or reduce employment, thus harming workers' welfare. But there is a missing stakeholder in this literature, namely the people incurring the cost of toxic pollution. And this is an academic gap, and the goal of today's research will be to fill this gap. Also, maybe more than a yes or no answer, we are interested in the economic mechanism, the friction that is driving the effect, and how can we relate this effect to economic models that we know. Why do we care about pollution in the private equity sphere? So from the last 10 years, at least in the US, private equity firms have invested heavily in industries that generate a significant amount of waste, 30 to 40% of the acquisitions according to Preqin. And this includes the natural resource industry, the energy, the heavy industry, and the infrastructure sectors. Also, pollution matters because in the short run, it has effects on public health, worker productivity, housing prices, but also in the long run, it is an important contributor of climate change. Part of the reason why no one has studied this question before is that it is difficult to do so. It is difficult because we need to answer 2 main challenges. The first one is to find microdata on pollution and its intensity. And private equity firms, they usually target private firms and small and new firms. And basically these firms, they are not available for all the previous databases that have been used in the previous literature. Like for instance, the data that we use in the previous great paper from Ian, TRI has a report threshold that don't cover small firms that PE firms will usually target. The second challenge is an NDHT problem. Unfortunately for us, we don't have a counterfactual and we cannot observe the same firm without PE ownership. So the way I handle the challenges today is by focusing on one industry. I restrict my analysis in the oil and gas industry. Why does this help me to do so? Because by focusing on this industry, I collect new administrative data on chemicals that oil and gas firm when they frack a well. So I have my unit of observation will be at the project level. Secondly, a particular feature of this industry is when a firm pollutes, it emits flames. And there have been some recent advances in physics and remote sensing that provide us some tool that we can use to recover this flame from the sky. Therefore, with these two databases, I have a unique and novel picture of corporate environmental policies on two high-frequency project-level datasets. And the good thing with the sky data is that it is reporting free. I mean, reporting bias free. People, they don't time the cloud on the sky to just like avoid polluting. To handle the second problem, the endogeneity of PE deals, I adopt and validate a nearest neighbor research design. So my assumption, my identifying assumption in this analysis will be to say that if you have a project that is owned by a PE-backed firm, if you take the closest neighbor, then this can be used as a valid counterfactual. Although this is a strong assumption, I provide several pieces of evidence that indirectly support it. For instance, before the acquisition, I show that characteristics are balanced when you restrict at this level of comparison. Then I use the richness of this setting by using a novel natural experiment and an undocumented class of PE contracts to better understand the economic channel that is driving the effect I observe in my data. Also, what we gain in terms of internal validity by focusing on one industry is not really done at the expense of external validity. Why? Because when you look in terms of funding attractivity, the oil and gas is the second sector in the US for the last 10 years. Moreover, we are talking about more than 55 million households that live in a shale basin as of today. 30% of methane emissions come from the oil and gas industry in the US, and the methane is 80 times more potent than CO2 and is one of the main contributors of CO2. My findings are the following. PE ownership causes a drop in pollution. This drop is statistically significant and economically meaningful. I observe a drop of 70%. I observe a drop that is equivalent to 70% in the baseline level for toxic pollutants. And for my measure of using satellite data, it is equivalent to half of the baseline rate of flaring. Why do I observe such a drop in pollution? This is consistent with two economic theories. The first one is that PE firms reduce agency friction between shareholder and managers, and I observe a reduction in pollution when it maximizes long-term shareholder value. The second channel comes from the fact that if you want to sell a polluted assets in the private market, this is extremely difficult. Why? Because polluted assets are traded for a negative discount. And this is a fact I document. And the reason why is because if you buy a new polluted asset, you will be exposed to more environmental liability risk. For instance, you will be exposed to environmental, to cleanup costs by the US Superfund. You will be exposed to environmental torts, litigation, future compliance costs. People, they don't observe this risk perfectly. They have heterogeneous information set. They have heterogeneous beliefs about the distribution of this risk. Then they have different, at the end of the day, they have different valuation for the same asset with different level of pollution. There are different willingness to pay. So this will create heterogeneous demand and when you have heterogeneous demand, we know from IO 101 that you as a producer have an incentive to change the product. So in our case, the producer is a PE firm. The PE firm has an incentive to make the portfolio company cleaner for two main reasons, and I won't be able to disentangle the two reasons. The first one is by making the asset cleaner, you attract more buyers. Then when you have more buyers in equilibrium, your selling price is higher. And the other channel is by having a cleaner asset, you can either sell the asset at a higher price, because now you are able to attract buyers with a higher valuation. I apologize if you're already very familiar with the oil and gas industry. Let me provide you some basic background so that we are all in the same level. The way an oil and gas firm work is very simple. They just need to find a piece of land and then drill a well. In doing so, they have two main different ways of polluting. The first one is by extracting the oil and gas trapped into the rock. They need to inject high pressure water mixed with toxic components to create some cracks into the rock so that they can extract the resource. And this is the first way of polluting. The second way is by burning the gas that is extracted from the well. Why do these firms burn the gas that is extracted from the well? Because in this industry, oil and gas are often co-product, which means that when you're just interested in the oil, you will have to extract some gas. And if you're just interested in the oil and you extract some gas, most of the time, if you're not interested in it, you will burn it. And this is a huge amount of pollution in the oil and gas industry. Let me summarize 1 year of work in 1 minute. I collect new administrative database that I merge to commercial data in this sector, where I observe at the project level. The way I will define my toxic component will be by using congressional reports. This definition of toxicity is interesting for two main reasons. The first one is that these components are exempt in the 2005 Energy Act from federal regulation, which means that and this exemption is highly controversial. So I observe a way of polluting that is legal yet controversial and exposed to environmental harm. And the second reason why I use this list of toxic components is they are supported by local anecdotal evidence of contamination. So we know that when oil and gas firms use, for instance, lead into the fracking, this can pollute the surrounding water, thus creating some clear damage to local people. Then my second measure of pollution is based on the fact that when oil and gas firm pollute, you can observe it from the sky. And then, using some physics formula, the Max Planck equation, for instance, you can record it from the sky. And this is my second measure of pollution, whether they produce CO2 and burn this gas. At the end of the day, I have a sample of 130,000 projects that started between 2010 and 2019. In this graph, you can see the geographical distributions of the project I have in my sample. To put a dollar value on the project I have, this is equivalent to $100 billion project. On average, one firm in my sample will have 100 projects, and the average rate of pollution is a bit more than 1 project out of 4 will pollute, and 1 project out of 5 will flare the well. At the end of the day, I have 106 PA deals. The way I use the PA deal comes from 3 sources: PitchBook, Preqin, and another data vendor I found specialized in the oil and gas industry. These deals have a transfer of ownership, that these deals are made by 55 PE firms. And then I observed 50 DRILCO contracts. What are DRILCO contracts? This is the second important component of my empirical design. A DRILCO contract is a type of contract that PE firms use in the oil and gas industry that is very particular to this industry. It's when a PE firm will just provide financing without any change in control rights. So basically, a PE firm will buy some working interest in a trench of wells without really looking at how the management do the drilling. And you have a citation from Tim Murray from Benefit Street Partners that say, we don't micromanage operational details about how you're fracking the wells in a DRILCO. This will be interesting to understand a bit more the channel that drive the effect. So armed with this new database, let's look at the net impact of PE ownership on pollution. We cannot regress my measure of pollution on PE ownership. Why? Because of an indigeneity problem. And this comes from the fact that in the oil and gas industry, PE firms will acquire their target companies when the firm will reach some major milestones in their development, such as an expansion. So when a firm is about to expand, most of the time it will receive some PE funding, and then the expansion can correlate with variables that will change my marginal cost and benefit of polluting. So let's take an example to really understand the indigeneity problem. Here you have firm 1 that is drilling in location L. At time 1, it happens that in location L, the porosity of the rock is low, so there is no need to use a lot of toxic components. At time 2, the firm is drilling in location L, that is a different type of rock with a high degree of porosity. Between time 1 and time 2, the firm wants to expand its production, so sell some shares to a PE firms. So if you just do a before-after comparison, you would just observe an increase in pollution. But this increase would just be driven by the fact that now the firm is drilling in a different type of rock. So the project that the firm has used changed. Now we are not comparing apple to apple. So this is an important ESG problem. And the way I suggest to solve it is by saying that you can use the closest neighbor, as you can see in this graph, as valid counterfactual. Why does it make sense to use the closest neighbor in this setting as counterfactual? Because most of the heterogeneity in the marginal cost and benefit of polluting in this sector will come from the land. Basically, the type of rock will be the same for two projects that are close to each other. Moreover, the local population that drive the marginal cost of polluting, for instance, if there is a city close to my well, will be the same for two wells that are close to each other. Moreover, the local supply of chemicals, most of the time firms buy from suppliers that are in the same region. This will be the same for two firms that are close to each other. Finally, public infrastructure, for instance, pipeline, that is the major cost when you want to connect your well to a pipeline to avoid flaring comes from the proximity to pipeline. Similarly, for two firms that are close to each other, this cost will be the same. And I showed that before the acquisition, when you just look at when you compare the firm that will be acquired by PE firm and the other, the closest neighbor, I showed that there is a balanced sample between the two, which provide me some indirect evidence that this identifying assumption makes sense. So how do I translate this identifying assumption into a regression framework? So I regress my measure of pollution, Y, that is defined at the P project level for firm A that drill in location J at time T on a firm fixed effect, plus a year fixed effect interacted with my location measures. This is a simple way to put the level of comparison at the project level. Then I estimate an event windows around the deal. And finally, I add very detailed controls at the project level, such as the size of the well, the horizontal and vertical size, the production of gas and oil. And then so this is the main result. In the x-axis, you have the semester around the deal. In the y-axis, you have the gamma tau that is estimated above. For instance, here, with what this coefficient is telling me, this is telling me the difference between a non-PE-backed firm and its closest PE-backed firm neighborhood 4 semesters after the deal when you control for all observables. As you can see before the acquisition, I don't have any pre-trade. Then you see a drop in pollution that is increasing with time. The reduction is jointly statistically significant and is economically meaningful. We are talking about a reduction equivalent to 70% in the baseline number of toxic components. Then I use my satellite data that is a bit more noisier, as I show in the paper, because you have the cloud, and when you have a cloud, you cannot really observe it from the sky. With this concern in mind, however, you still find a reduction that is increasing with time and that is statistically significant and economically meaningful, equivalent to half of the baseline rate in flaring for my sample. However, when you change the type of deals and when we focus on PE contracts that imply just financing, but no change in control rights, so when the PE firm has no ability to control the management team, I don't find any effect. And this absence of evidence is highly robust. So although we can still explain this result with a lot of, although these 3 results can help us to close some explanations, there are still a large set of explanations that are consistent with these results. So to understand a bit more the channels, I will use a natural experiment in this section. So the Bureau of Land Management is responsible for environmental regulation in Native American reservation and federal land. And what is interesting for us is these boundaries have been decided at the end of the 19th century or the beginning of the 20th century and are thus orthogonal to shale basins that have been discovered only at the beginning of the 21st century. So the basic idea I will do is a triple difference in differences and exploiting some shocks that come in this ability of this federal regulation to regulate fracking. More specifically, between 2012 and 2015, the BLM was drafting a rule to regulate fracking in these areas. However, in 2015, you have a preliminary injunction that is filed to challenge this fracking rule. Then the rule will be abrogated by the District of Wyoming. And then after that, the Trump administration is inaugurated and decided that BLM should not be able to regulate fracking. And basically all these legal texts use the fact that as fracking is exempt from a federal regulation, as the BLM purpose is referred to this federal regulation, then BLM is not allowed to regulate fracking. After 2018, however, a state of California and a group of environmental activists sued the BLM for voiding the fracking rule. So I have basically a period where the ability of BLM to regulate fracking was extremely low because of this court ruling and the change in the Trump administration. So the way I explore these shocks is by running a triple difference in differences. I will not go over the whole equation, but to provide you some intuition, I take the difference in pollution between regulated and non-regulated areas for projects that are close to each other, so at the boundaries, okay? So you see it's like a RDD. I take the projects that are in a Native American reservation and the closest neighbor, they have built drilling at the same time. And I take this difference, you can think of a spread, I take this spread for both PE-backed firm and non-PE-backed firm. And this difference, I will take it after I purge out of all firm level characteristics, and I include a firm EFX effect to include any change that happens at the firm level. So the results are the following. As you can see here, the spread between regulated and non-regulated area for PE-backed firm relative to non-PE-backed firm increases when regulatory risk is lower. So basically you have more relative pollution in areas where regulatory risk is lower for PE-backed firms. So the effect I observe is a function of regulatory risk. This is extremely precious for me because it allows me to better understand the theories that drive this effect. This helps me to reject theories based on non-pecuniary motivation. Because if PE firms want to make the world a better place, then this effect shouldn't correlate with regulatory risk and the ability of a federal agency to regulate fracking in Native American reservation. Also, this shock helps me to better to rule out an explanation fully driven by technological change, because there are no reasons that this shock I observe will correlate with technological progress. So first, I observe it very well because I observe the size, the type of technology that project use, so I control for that. But if you don't really believe in my controls, this shock basically helped me to reject an effect fully driven by technological change, because there is no reason why this shock will correlate with technological change. Then in the paper, I spent a lot of time trying to better understand the channel driving the effect. I ran many tests. The first one is consistent with an investment horizon channel. So basically, there is asymmetric information between managers and the owner of the firm. Then managers have an incentive to signal their type, so they will take inefficient actions in a situation is polluting. And I found that PE firms basically align better incentive between managers and shareholders, and therefore this allows for long-term wealth creation. And I show it basically by looking at public listing. So when I replicate the analysis you showed before, after and before an IPO, you show that pollution increases, and firms that are close to miss their earning targets start increasing more. So basically, this shows me that in my control group, I have public listing associated with more pollution. Also, a nice thing that is interesting with this setting is I can observe the cash flow for flaring. So I collect new data from the North Dakota Environmental Department, where basically they collect all the flaring cash flows. And what I show is you need to be a long-term investor. You need to value a lot long-term cash flows if you want to reduce flaring. Why? Because if you want to connect your well to a pipeline, you need to pay several millions at the beginning of the project, and then it will only pay off 5 to 10 years after the project is drilled. So if you have short-term incentive, you will not connect your well to a pipeline. And then the second channel I find is that PE firms reduce pollution to increase the exit value. And the reason why, it's because polluted assets in the M&A and assets to asset market is penalized assets that are polluted. If you want to sell a polluted asset, you will have to sell it at a lower price. Although I lack quasi-natural experimentation to show this fact, I rely on the new data sets and I observe a very high degree of controls. For instance, I can observe the acreage or the potential value. These variables are variables that practitioners use when they decide to purchase a project. So although I don't, and what I do is I include these controls step by step. So I first show the raw relationship, and then I include the control step by step. And you see that the negative discount is very persistent. And finally, I include a seller and a buyer fixed effect. So when the same seller and the same buyer sell assets, you can see that assets that are polluted are traded with a negative discount. So although it's a result I think we should be cautious to look at, because I don't have way to validate the identifying assumption I put. I think this is strong suggestive evidence that if you want to sell a polluted asset, this would be done with a negative discount. So basically, you as an owner, as a PE firm, if you want to maximize your exit value, you know that if you sell a polluted asset, you will sell it at a lower price. So PE firms are value maximizing firm. They want to maximize their exit value. So as we know from IO 101, if by selling a polluted asset, you will sell it at a lower price, you have an incentive to make it cleaner, either by increasing more buyers, or by making cleaner, you can sell it at a higher price to attract the buyers that value a lot cleaner assets. And I show in the paper that the interaction of these two effects explain why the decrease in pollution is increasing with time. Because the more you hold the asset, the more likely is the PE firm to exit. And when you're close to exit, you really want to make your asset cleaner as possible to maximize the exit value, which is why I observe a decrease of pollution with time. So let me conclude. I found that PE control leads to a reduction in pollution that is economically and statistically significant. It is driven by pecuniary motives from a long-term investor. And I think one implication that is relevant for practitioners is that we have seen recently a huge initiative to decarbonize portfolio, especially from the oil and gas industry. And one implication of my paper is that be careful, this can basically backfire. Because if for instance, in my sample, you change the corporate governance of firm in the oil and gas industry, then this could create an incentive for these firms to pollute more. So to come back with this initiative, people say usually that we want to stop investing in the oil and gas industry. Why? Because in doing so, we will increase the cost of capital. By making the cost of capital, we reduce production. But what my paper shows is that if you also change the corporate governance of this sector can start producing, but by polluting much more. And given the magnitude of pollution that this sector is responsible for, then I think we should be cautious about this initiative to decarbonize portfolios. Thank you very much for your attention, and it's still a work in progress. So if you have any question, please feel free to reach me.
Perfect. Thank you. The discussant is Carl Lins. You have around 10 minutes. There's a lot of questions. So, Aymeric, you can look at the Q&A if you want. Otherwise, I will pick a few. Once you're done responding to Carl, I will pick a few and read the questions. All right, Carl.
Go. I needed to get permission to share screen, and I think I've got it now. Let's see if it's getting. Are you guys getting? I didn't have a chance to test it because I had to come on midstream. Are you getting my screen as the entire thing? So
try to hit F5.
Let's getting it now.
Yep.
Awesome. All right. So let me first of all thank Bo and the other organizers for allowing me the chance to discuss. It's fun to see a very data intensive paper. So Aymeric, when you said you spent a year processing data, I think I heard that. I'm sympathetic as a PhD student. It's kind of high risk, and hopefully this will be high return for you as well in matching it together. And mainly the comments I'm going to have, I think that you did a good job presenting it, is just going to be ways to try to frame it better. I think, especially totality of what you have, especially as you add new tests and you want to have kind of a coherent theme based on the kind of preponderance of evidence. So that's what my comments will be mainly about. And at the very end, I've got a few that are just specific to writing that I probably won't read out, to everybody, because, after 4 presentations, you don't want to read something about appendix table A10 that might be, better presented in a different way. So that's where we'll go. So here we go. So the main thing I had as kind of a complicating factor in my understanding of the paper was to try to get at the takeaways. There seem to be different takeaways, and the consistent theme, like if you want to look at the headline of the abstract or what you would do somebody in a 20-second elevator pitch, is that private equity ownership leads to less pollution. And then there's several channels on my slide, but one thing that I was hoping to see is kind of a linkage to the increasing work on large-scale institutional owners wanting to reduce pollution, just because it's, they expect to hold assets in the long run, whether they sell them or not is kind of an independent choice, and they need to be less polluting in order to get that kind of an exit, or just to be more valuable in the long run. So I'm kind of excited about that, but then I quickly see that when a private equity firm now doesn't have to, or maybe doesn't have to, stop its pollution of groundwater potentially by using heavy chemicals or polluting chemicals in the fracking process, then they don't. So this is where the rule is kind of relaxed, or at least it's seen like it might go away in 2012, 13, 14, 15. I can't remember the exact timing. Now it's not that PE is doing less pollution, it's just that PE is doing more pollution when it can get away with it, which is just different. So it's like, it's hard to have the takeaway being PE pollutes less, when in fact, as soon as they're able to not worry about pollution, they pollute more. So try to frame that maybe a little bit different, that PE responds to different types of incentives depending on, that. And then the other thing that is kind of tricky about this, I think I have it on a later slide, is if private equity is really looking at a long run exit, we're talking about maybe 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 years from the time you actually do the drilling for some of the wells, they're probably expecting regulations to change. So something maybe a little spurious with this idea that, or with the data where you find on the Native American reservations or the federal land that the pollution goes up for a little bit and then it goes back down when there's a little more possible challenge by California's environmental activists. Almost everyone in the oil and gas industry the last 20 years would know that regulations are likely to change, where fracking is going to be more regulated. So I just don't think they would like, oh, we can get away with it. Oh, now we can't. So maybe check for robustness on that. And then what I really wanted to have fleshed out and almost like draw a diagram mentally is this idea, and I think it's great. You have two independent sources of pollution data, but try to describe what the decision process is on how much to spend, so to speak, on pollution abatement. The first is a decision on whether to use toxic chemicals in the fracking process. That's a year zero choice, and you're stuck with it from now on. You go in there and you prop things up with the sand proppants, and you stick a bunch of other things in there that are going to more deeply penetrate, and then some of it comes back more polluted because you chose 6 relatively polluting chemicals, and then the groundwater is that's stuck. You got to deal with it. Now everybody's gonna say, whoa, that set of wells has the potential for groundwater contamination. Whereas flaring is essentially you're producing the whole time, some oil, some gas, well, some gas if it's flaring, otherwise there's no flaring. And if you start to get regulations, or you start to say, wow, we want to sell this entire field or this whole package of fields in the Permian Basin, let's spend the money to hook up to a pipeline. And now we can say we are not a flaring company. So you can kind of defer the expense. And I think that would possibly give you different ways to tease out, the severity of pollution that private equity will tolerate. So just maybe make that more of an integrated part of your paper. And then I liked it, and I think you did a great job trying to do the best you can, but the piece on it towards the end about looking at sort of like the public versus private pollution incentives, I unfortunately think it's kind of too narrow to be usable. And the reason is you have 7 IPOs, and that doesn't necessarily mean that's reflective of all publicly owned oil and gas companies' incentives for pollution abatement. And so, IPOs are often an exit for an owner. And I looked a little more carefully at what this is, and I saw Kinder Morgan, and I thought, oh my gosh, okay, this is going to be a problem. So are any of these IPOs that are exits between 2011 and 19 affiliated with private equity? And the answer is huge and yes, because Kinder Morgan, private equity in 2006, and then they went on in 2011 to basically go public, and then they did a bunch of roll-ups of all kinds of other, you know, acquisitions of existing medium-sized, and it would sit there and have the contract term ability to say, oh, we just bought you and now stop using a bunch of fracking chemicals that are polluting. It's like a huge company with a whole bunch of moving parts and then 6 other smaller IPOs that are all put together kind of in one model. So maybe do it as a case study and really dig into what Kinder Morgan did, but I don't know that we can do much else with that. And then also just, there is a lot of evidence, especially, so maybe that's why Bo picked me as a discussant, but after the BP Deepwater Horizon event, institutional investors from everywhere, all around the world, and especially pension plans and just general institutional investors that had shares in publicly traded oil and gas companies around the world, they pretty much forced these companies to improve their environmental performance. So this is, you know, 10 years ago, it's been known for publicly traded firms that they've got to improve oil and gas environmental performance. So that maybe can be something you can use to link in with the incentives to pollute or not. And then the final thing that I was going to have here on just advice is this. It's written up as though there's going to be a lot of tests when you say that private equity wants to maximize exit value, and let's look at some transactions where that happens with an independent database, which is nice. But by the time you really get down to the usable transactions where you're kind of controlling for buyer and seller and as well as well characteristics, there's not a significant result. And what I believe might be going on here is it's just the reasons that oil and gas wells or acreages are bought or sold are just so variable. It's just really going to be hard to find pollution as one piece. You have operational efficiency, adjoining acreage. One operator's got a financial constraint, and they were using something cheap, and now you're able to do it systematically. There's a whole lot of things that go on, I think. And what you probably have in mind is a private equity firm that comes in and says, we're going to put in best practices, including using the right type of sand proppants and the right type of chemicals, and roll it out to all of our wells that are there. But I think all the transactions are just too muddy. That just doesn't happen that often. It's just going to be a bunch of piecemeal transactions, kind of like real estate deals in different neighborhoods. There's really no one way to summarize that. So
2 minutes.
Thank you, Bo. And so one thing I was going to suggest, and it struck me, in fact, let me back it up and frame that way. I don't want to have to read it directly. I like the test of the Native American lands and federal lands all of a sudden being subject to a regulatory shock, and people realizing that, you know, the Trump administration said, hey, we're going to void that rule. I thought 4 years ago about doing a paper on oil and gas pollution and kind of extractive industries pollution, with the even bigger shock in which I think you could use your entire sample of firms, not just, you know, everywhere. So you're getting the West Texas basins and the Pennsylvania and North Dakota. And that is just look at what all the private equity owned oil and gas production did when you had the unexpected kind of natural experiment of Trump being elected. I mean, that was truly unexpected. And it was absolutely known that he would not give a crap about enforcing any extractive industry or, you know, environmental regulations. And now see what PE did in the last 4 years. That seems like a huge test and clean and hopefully a large enough sample. So that's what this slide here is talking about. You know, it was very surprising, the election of Trump, you know, on election day and afterwards, see what happened. Or so the oil and gas private equity firms do more or less polluting post the Trump event. And then the final things here are just, because I've got probably 30 seconds, I'm just going to send you the slides, but just be careful to write and define things, you know, decide what's important for the text. There's way too many footnotes up front. There's a huge introduction. There's a whole bunch of tables. Then there's a big a set of institutional characteristics. Try to put that together in a tight way and try to use words, you know, like negative discounts, kind of confusing and that kind of stuff. So I will exit the screen and I will turn it over to
Emmerich, you can decide how you want to use the last 5 minutes of the day. You can discuss comments, or if you prefer, I will select questions from the Q&A from the participants. Up to you.
Thank you. So maybe I can give a quick answer to Carl, and maybe we can go through the Q&A. Thank you so much, Carl, for the remarks. I think they make a lot of sense. I think for the Indian Native American reservation test, I have like a firm year fixed effect. So the effect I'm recovering is like, it's a spread between non-regulated and regulated areas. So maybe, they drop pollution overall, but they drop it less for Native American reservation. And I think I would spend any more time to make it clear in the text, that what I remember, like it was maybe not written as it should be. So maybe I will spend more time, writing it and saying, this is really a relative pollution effect. So you can reduce pollution overall, but reduce it a bit less in Native American reservation because you know that the marginal cost is lower. And I totally agree with you, about the buyer seller thing. There are so many things that happen when you want to sell a tranche of wealth or a piece of wealth. I totally agree, and I think this is why I have a high standard error. Even when I add all the controls, you can see that the standard error I have in the effect is extremely large. And I think this is consistent with this idea that even if I have an economic impact by the coefficient, like the point estimate is significantly large. However, I have a large variation, a large standard error. And I think this is coming from the fact that, as you were saying, there are so many things, so many different variables that come into place when you want to buy a piece of land. And I think, in some places, they really don't care about pollution. Maybe they care it more if you had like an environmental lawsuit in the neighborhood. There are so many things that can happen. But the thing that I found with this database, I still found this negative correlation. Even when I add controls over and over, sometimes they become imprecise and non-significant, but the point estimate is the same. Kind of suggests me that this exit pressure channel is there. And then I think maybe we should talk more about the other point. And thank you so much for the discussion.
Great. We have about a minute or two. Would you like me to read you one or two of the questions in the chat?
Yeah, perfect. Yeah, thanks.
Okay. So here's a question from an anonymous attendee. It says, so is the conclusion that PE representatives follow legislation and societal constraints better than other firms?
I totally agree with this conclusion, actually. It makes a lot of sense. Like a VP firm says, super maximizer owner that will take all the piece of information that are out there and to maximize it. So you have this industry that is exempt and is kind of controversial why this industry was exempt from federal regulation. And they know that this will change in the near future. So they start reducing pollution by anticipating this pattern. Well, I totally buy the conclusion, yeah. Thanks.
Okay, perfect. That was my favorite question from the Q&A. And now it is 5 minutes past 5 Swedish time, maybe breakfast time for Carl, and very late for some of our attendants. I want to thank everybody for joining us today. Day 2 of this conference promises to be as exciting and informative. It starts at 2 p.m. Central European time tomorrow. And I look forward to seeing everybody there. Thank you so much for being here today.